So we're just going to kind of do a surface level talk about the components that go into Islandora, a little bit background on some aspects of Drupal you should be familiar with if you want to start development on it. And we're going to wrap up with some debugging tools and little things that might help you along the way. I've set up an environment so that people can kind of play around with things. It should be as simple as possible to get going up with this one. It doesn't have a lot of the same features you'd have with like ILDC for development, but it's really just kind of like something that hopefully can run on every platform and will have minimal problems and it'll be easiest to go forward. So if we, can I hop there? Yeah, so it's just a Git repository. The first section describes about how you should get Docker desktop set up on your computer and what the required settings should be for that. And then there's just under the running section, the singular command you can copy and paste into your terminal. Once you see install completed in the log output, then you can visit any one of these URLs to see like your Drupal site or the IDE that's built in. So you can browse around through all of the Drupal code and Islandora code, ActiveMQ for queues, Solar, BlazeGraph, oh sorry, this one's BlazeGraph, and Fedora, yada, yada, yada. But we'll get to that stuff later. Yeah, as I was saying, there's at a high level with Islandora, we have I should actually stand close to the microphone. I forget you folks are half virtual. So anyways, yeah, so we've got a number of components that go into your typical Islandora install. The only one that's really required is Drupal at the sort of like base level, but you'll be hard pressed to find a single Islandora installation that is only Drupal. We'll typically have a number of these different components. So Drupal is the web framework. It's where users log in, they add content, they view content, that sort of thing. Cantaloupe is an image server that's particularly used for like large images, things like JP2s, stuff that's quite large. You can zoom in, pan, lots of good stuff. We'll see that in a bit. Solar is used for search typically. I mean, you can get away without a Solar. You can use now in Islandora 2.0, you can just use Drupal search if you want to, but almost everyone, they go with Solar because you have just better search with that. ActiveMQ, so it's a queue that's used for communication between Islandora proper and say all the microservices that are implemented under Alpaca. So what happens is Islandora posts a stomp message onto the ActiveMQ. It gets consumed by Alpaca and then passed on to one of the microservices. So Fedora, BlazeGraph. Fedora is the repository where a lot of institutions keep their data in addition to having it stored in Drupal. It's not a requirement anymore for Islandora 2.0, but lots of institutions still use it. BlazeGraph is a triple store for those who aren't familiar. Basically, that's a triple is an expression of subject, verb, object, is a way to like map relationships between things. It's also optional. Not a lot of institutions use that if they don't have any requirement for it. And then we have derivatives, which is pretty much used by everyone. I mean, this is how you get, you upload an image and you get various versions of it, like a thumbnail or what have you. And that's supported by Crayfish and Crayfits and some others. And aside from all those, there are a few that are a little bit more rare in use. Handle, which is used for minting handles. RipWrap, which is used for fixity checks. And Maptimo, which is used for analytics, like how many times has this been downloaded or how many page views has this got, that sort of thing. Here's a diagram for Islandora 8. This one's a little bit out of date. So like Gemini is no longer a microservice, but you get the sort of the broad strokes of it. We have a web server, Apache in this case, that is serving from Drupal to the end user who's using their web browser to interact with Islandora. Solar is providing some data. MySQL is providing data. You have Apache Karif, which again, this is sort of out of date. You can now run Alpaca as just like a singular jar. You don't have to use Karif anymore. But anyways, it's consuming from the queue and then passing on to the various microservices that are also running under Apache, so Houdini, Hypercube, Homerus. We'll talk about some of these a bit more. And finally, at the bottom corner, you've got Tomcat, which is running Fedora and the image server Cantaloupe and what have you. First, we're going to talk about Drupal, since this is kind of like the most fundamental aspect of the stack. It's got a lot of features, it's got a lot of components. We're only going to be talking about a small fraction of them. The slides will be compact and link heavy. Don't worry about this. We're not going to go into too great a detail. They're really just there as kind of references that you can sort of come back to later. Like, I was interested in that and I want to know more about like the Service API. You can then follow the link and read more about it. Yeah, what is Drupal? I mean, I'm coming at this as if you don't know anything about the stack or with Islandor. So we're going to start from the very beginning. So Drupal is free. It's open source. It's a content management system. It's written in PHP. It's licensed with GPL 3 or 2? No, 2. It's really popular. I mean, this is probably the reason why we picked it in the first place over 10 years ago. It's used by at least 14% of the top 10,000 websites worldwide. 1.2% of the top 10 million. It has a really large community, much larger than sort of like us, but the nice thing is that that large community can provide code and modules and things that we can also use with Islandor now, especially in Islandor 2.0, since it's more Drupal-centric than our previous version. Drupal is the backbone to Islandora, and unfortunately, Drupal documentation is a bit lacking for 8+. You might have browsed the wikis before and come across a lot of to do, document later, under construction, etc. I tend to find the best way to learn with Drupal is to start with the documentation at least, yeah, but then to just kind of read through the code base. A lot of things you probably won't really get to the meat of unless you kind of go read through the code. And we'll do a little bit of that while we're talking. So at the base level for Drupal, it requires a web server, either Nginx or Apache. Apache is more popular. Drupal ships with some .htaccess file, so it makes it easier to configure from starting up. Nginx, less so, but Nginx is considered more performant. So take your pick. I've got a link there to the starting recipe if you want to configure Nginx for using Drupal. Then it supports a myriad of database backends, MySQL, Postgres, SQLite, a couple of Microsoft ones and some other things. MySQL and the derivatives thereof of like MariaDB and whatever. They're more popular and better tested with Drupal. Postgres, it's considered more performant, but it's not as tested as well. You might come across edge cases. And just as a broad stroke, don't use SQLite. Don't use any of the Microsoft ones. Just avoid it. You'll have headaches. It's not worth the time. Some other things around databases, you might read and know them quite well and have features that you'd want to use with Drupal. Drupal really pares down what's available to you at the database layer through its APIs. And it's best to approach it from a Drupal-centric approach first than being like, I really know Postgres well. I want to use Postgres because I like this feature and want to use it. And then you go to use it with Drupal and find that it's not supported. PHP, currently 8.1 is the recommended version. With Isle, I think it's like on 7 something. You don't necessarily have to be there, but it's always good to be at the latest. And then the core dependencies for Drupal are Symfony and Doctrine. So Symfony provides like a lot of the web functionality. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And Doctrine we won't talk about, but it's the ORM layer that kind of wraps around the databases.
I think for PHP 7.4, it's got
okay.
earliest one you use.
Yeah, so for those folks on virtual, 7.4 is the earliest version of PHP that you can use with Drupal 8 and 9. And then not a requirement, but definitely, I mean, just use it. You're going to save yourself a lot of trouble. You can use Composer to fetch and install dependencies. The link there to the recommended project, which is supported by the Drupal community, which will pull in everything and set up a Drupal site for you. I mean, you can use Isle and you can use the Ansible aspects of Islandor to set these things up. But if you wanted to start from scratch, you want to maintain it yourself, go with the recommended project. Both Isle and I think the Ansible project are based on that anyways. So yeah, there's a lot of Drupal concepts. There are many more than are on this single slide. I tried to put the ones that I think are most important. On the right-hand side, we have core, module, and themes. So it's really sort of a logical grouping of code. Core would be like the libraries and components that go into Drupal but aren't modules. Modules being things that rely on those core libraries. And then themes are very much like modules. They're almost the same, except for they exclusively deal with like display logic, templates, and that sort of thing. Probably look at my notes instead of just talking. Oh yeah, so concepts span over APIs, modules, and themes. So you'll see stuff like there'll be a core library for accounts and users, and then there's also a users module, and there'll be a dependencies between them when you're reading through the code base. So you won't sort of encapsulate a single idea in one spot. It tends to spread across several APIs. We're going to talk about some of the core APIs, mainly service, plugins, and routing, which you're going to, and entities, which are pretty much going to be used by all the modules and things. So that's a good starting point. Yeah, so learning about one thing often bleeds into other bits, so it becomes a bit difficult to talk about one thing in isolation. So like, don't feel too frustrated if you're like, well, what's that? And why are you talking about this other thing? I just wanted to talk about users. It takes a while to build up on those little fundamentals before everything else starts to like click. Oh yeah, another note, it may be confusing from time to time when I say core or user, because it'll refer to several things. Like core as a concept is just like the Drupal repository that ships. It does include modules, but there's also the concept of like core libraries, which don't include modules. I'll try to be as clear as possible when I talk about some of these things, but you know, I'm gonna mess up. Oh yeah, so for example, we could be talking about like the user module, the user entity, the user controller, the user context, events relating to the user, the concept of a logged in user, i.e. an account interface, etc. And I might just say user for all of these things while I'm talking. So it's not just you, don't hesitate to be like, hey, what? And then I'll stop. So yeah, Symfony's role in Drupal. So this is a core dependency. I'm not going to talk any great deal about this stuff. By and large, you can just skip it. Like you don't have to go read the Symfony documentation to get a really good understanding of Drupal. But from time to time, you'll run into things, especially around like event dispatching or dependency injection or maybe routing, where you're like, hey, like, or validating, what's going on here? And you'll be forced to essentially go read the Symfony's documentation to see why Drupal is doing things the way it's doing. But oftentimes you can get away without doing that. So this is the Drupal folder structure, and this is really fundamental to know where to look for things when you're trying to figure out a problem. We've got core include, which is like bootstrap and install stuff. You'll almost never go in there unless you're writing like an install profile. Core misc, which is some JavaScript and some SVGs. This is like public assets, stuff that just gets downloaded to the client. You'll pretty much never look in here unless you're like writing something JavaScripty and you want to see how core does it and you just want to copy and paste some stuff or figure out what's going on. But by and large, you won't really have to deal with it. Now, the core lib, two folders, there's component and core. The only real difference between these is like the rules for what dependencies they're allowed to have. So core components, they're not allowed to have any dependencies except for external things like Symfony or some other vendor library for PHP, whereas core can depend on other core bits and components. So it's just one more level, but these are still not modules. The next bit, core modules, is sort of like Drupal dogfooding its own structure. So the main way in which you do Drupal development is through modules. And fortunately, core Drupal does that exactly the same way. So they use the same APIs you're using. They're going to be doing the same things you want to do. So it's a really good place to look if you want to, copy code or understand a bit of code, be core modules. And we'll talk about some important ones a little bit later in the talk. Core themes. They're just the ones that ship with core, same idea, modules. They're dogfooding their own API. And by dogfooding, I mean like, there's this term in software, if you've not heard it before, where they talk about you should use the things you make so you know what the experience is like. So assume you're making dog food, you should eat your own dog food. It's meant to be somewhat unpleasant. It's sort of an expression. But fortunately, like Drupal does this all the time. And so like there's no separation between like what the core developers work on and the APIs they have access to versus what you do. You have access to exactly the same stuff and the methods are exactly the same. So it's a really good place to like just look through and read. Core profiles, this is for install configuration. It's not that interesting. We're just going to skip over it. So for sites, you can have multiple sites with Drupal. It's like a multi-site supporting piece of software. A lot of people don't these days. They just deploy a single site to a single server or a Docker container or whatever, and then spin up multiple containers or multiple servers if they want to do multiple sites. In which case, you only really have to interact with like the site's default folder, because that's where you typically put in the root level site if you were having a multi-site. If you had other sites you wanted to have, it would be sites, myname.com would be the folder, and then you'd have a settings.php within that. Within all of the sites folders, you typically have the following files. So development services.yaml, which is like some debugging tools and aids. It needs to be enabled. You would do that through settings.local or settings.php to turn it on. The links there will have documentation about that and how it's to be done. Then sites.php, that's kind of at the top level. So that would describe each folder that you have and the various URL aliases, how Drupal should redirect your routes to like which of the sites that you're doing. We won't talk about that too much. There's links there that describe how that works. So everything on the left-hand side, that's core. And core is a look, no touch. Like you shouldn't make modifications to this. If you ever do, it should be as a patch. And that patch will generally come from like the Drupal.org website. And there's a process for that, which is documented. But basically, you shouldn't go in there and just edit things to fix your problems. If you have a problem in there, search Drupal.org for open issues, see if people are working on it, see if they have open patches, or if updating can potentially remove the problem for you. What they used to say, I remember ages ago, and I'm not sure if they say that still now with the Drupal community, is like every time you modify Drupal core, God kills a kitten. If anyone remembers that. So don't do that, right? That's great. Anyways, so on the right-hand side, there's contrib, custom, and install. You can muck about in these folders. So like these are the places where you can just like wildly make changes. Broadly, you're going to be bringing in other people's work. That's what contrib is for. And likely your work's going to live there and contrib too if you're intending to like share it in the wider community. If you don't care to share it in the wider community, if it's not very useful outside of your specific site, the modules custom folder is generally where you're going to keep that stuff. Themes, same idea as core, except for this is where you put contrib themes. Profiles, same idea as core, except for this is where you put contrib ones or ones that you write yourself. And yeah, we already talked about most of the things. The most important one of those files, though, in the sites folder name is settings.php. It's where like you'll have configuration for your database connection, all sorts of important stuff. It's hopefully we'll get into that. Now I can't quite remember if I talk about that. No, I don't. So it's quite important. But fortunately, like if you were to actually go to it, like let's open up Chrome. I thought I had a bunch of tabs open. You were to go for settings.php, it's heavily documented. So oftentimes with Drupal, you'll just want to go to some file and be like, I want to know what it does. It'll literally tell you inside of the file. There'll be large amounts of comments around each setting and configuration, tells you what it does, when you should enable it, etc. You'll have a read through that whenever you first set up your site. Yeah, there's a lot of Drupal APIs. I think I have all of the top level APIs on this slide and links to the relevant documentation. You're not going to read through all these. There's going to be some subset, and it's going to really depend on what you want to do. Some of these APIs are provided by the core libraries that I talked about before, so they're not modules, but a lot of them are a combination of core libraries and modules, like text editor. You're unlikely to touch on all these parts. It's going to depend on what you want to achieve. Some that you're like 100% guaranteed to interact with are like plugin and services, and so we're going to talk about those a little bit later. If you're going to display anything, you're going to be touching form, menu, rendering, and routing. If you want to model some new type of data that you'll want to manipulate or have the users manipulate, you'll be using entity and entity validation and type data. And then some are just kind of useful, like ancillary APIs like cache and logging, which you'll most likely run into. Cache can be really tricky. Unfortunately, we're probably not going to really dig into that much, but if people have questions later, hopefully I'll be able to talk about it.
I'll just comment that over the thing with Islandora Stack, I've touched maybe 3/4 of those over several years of work. Whatever's most relevant to what you're doing right now.
Yeah.
Target what you're looking at.
Copy and paste are your friends. Go look at another module, see what it's doing. Copy, edit, see what happens. It's a great way to learn. There's a lot of best practices when it comes to Drupal for security, coding standards, accessibility, usability, internationalization, and automated testing. By and large, you don't have to go read all this stuff up front. I mean, read the security one if you have the spare time. That's definitely worth it. Encoding standards, you're going to have to follow if you're going to get your code merged into the Islandor modules, because we've set up automated links and things for that. You can also automate good chunks of this if you're using ISLE or the Ansible playbook. I believe they install and set up this stuff for you, especially in the editor. I'll show you in a moment. Like, for example, I'm on media source service. I do something like a little command, sorry. There's like built-in things into this editor that'll help you do code linting, like run CBF on the current file or CBD on the module. It's copy-paste detection, and CBF is something, I can't remember. And CS is code sniffer, which is the one that does all the checks for lints. So that's the one I run all the time. We'll talk about that a little bit later if we got time.
CBF is the automated fixing.
The CBF fixes the problems with CS. Thank you. Talk about some services. So I heard you like dependencies. Who wants old memes? Great show. I love that show. Anyways, so yeah, dependency injection. It's a really big thing in Drupal. And that's largely enabled by the services API. And so this is really leaning on Symfony's service container, but you don't really have to go read that documentation. So yeah, it's useful for decoupling and reusing functionality. Services are pluggable, they are replaceable, so you can swap them in and out. You can have dependencies between services, so that's where the dependency injection comes in. It'll just insert the other dependencies in when you go to create the service. And then they can be tagged for special use cases. And this is all enabled by the service container. And we'll talk about this stuff as we get into it. There's some convenience functions like Drupal Entity Type Manager. You see in bolded near the bottom of the slide. Basically, they just call out to Drupal service, pass in the service name, and then return it to you. This is generally not recommended. They prefer you use dependency injection instead, and we're going to talk about how that works in a moment. So at the core of it, there's the service file. For all of core, so this is outside of modules. These are the services that are available regardless of what modules you have installed, is core services.yaml. Let's go take a gander at that. So just a regular old YAML file. What you'll see is a services section, and then what you'll have is the name of each service, generally prefixed by its module name that's providing it, or the API in this case, because there are no modules in core. And then you'll have the Drupal class, or PHP class, sorry, that will get instantiated and represent this service. The arguments that are to be passed to the constructor of that class, prefixed with an @ symbol. If they're not prefixed with an @ it's just a string, so you'd be passing in a string argument. But when it has the @ it's essentially meaning just another service. So this request stack here, if I copy and search, which is everywhere, which is probably not a great example, if I end that with a semicolon, you can see that, yes, it's also a service. So this service would get created first and then get passed into the service that we were just looking, oh my God, there's so many, just looking at cache context IP. So that's useful. And then tags, which we'll talk about a bit more in a moment, because that's a bit more complicated. Let's go back. So that's the core services.yaml in every site. Your modules can also provide a services file where you can declare your own services and consume other services as arguments to your services. There's another system for doing this instead of using the YAML files called auto wiring. I've not seen it used anywhere. I think this is sort of something they're going to be moving to in like Drupal 10 because it's something that's provided by Symfony. Just throwing out there the link if you want to read about it. I've never used it. There are a lot of properties you can use for your service when you're configuring it. By and large, you're not going to touch most of these, but I've got a link to the documentation if you're interested. You're pretty much just going to be doing class, arguments, and sometimes tags. So that's the bulk of it. So basically, this is just a method for aggregating services. So you create a named tag. You have some sort of action that you want to do, say like convert a parameter type. And then so your service does that. It converts the parameter type. You give it the tag parameter converter. And then whenever the routes are trying to process something coming in, it's like, okay, I have access to all of these parameter converters. Let's see which one works with this, and then it will go and use it. So it's sort of an aggregation method whenever multiple services may step in to do some bit of work rather than just having a singular one. That being said, it's unlikely you're going to need to write one. I've not had to yet, and I've been doing this for a while. It's more likely you're going to use an existing one. So the important ones, the ones I see used most frequently are access check for checks on routes, and we'll talk about routes a bit more in a minute. Cache context, which is providing information when going to cache something to say invalidate the cache. Something might be like, oh, the currently logged in user could be a cache context that would then affect if something gets cached or not. Context provider, context for actions. So actions would be something like select these bits of content and generate derivatives for them. We might show that in a bit when we get to the website. Event subscriber is the really big one. You're probably going to see that more often. I think I might even have a link. Yeah, we'll talk about the Islandor one down on the right-hand side. Param converter, service collector. Service collector is interesting in that it's a method to aggregate tags. Like if you're going to go write a tag service, you would then use service collector to write your tag service. So you tag in your tags because, you know, yo dog, I heard you like tags. Yeah, so let's look at the Islandor example. We've got JWT subscriber mentioned in the service file. So again, we've got a YAML file, mentions the name of the service. I'm not sure if folks can see that super well. I'm gonna like zoom in. So we've got the Islandor JWT subscriber is the name, the class. So this is the PHP class that will get instantiated to represent this service. Oddly enough, this one uses a factory to create itself using the method static method create on the class. It doesn't have to do that. It could have just used the constructor. I don't know. And then it's taking two arguments. So it's going to take the entity type manager service and the current user, and it's tagged as event subscriber. So well, let's hop back so we get to the exact links. So let's go look at the, oops, that's fine, it still worked. Let's look at the class. So it's going to implement an event. What's that? Oh yeah, sorry. There we go. Yeah, so whenever you're using tags, so like for event subscribers or access checks or what have you, they're generally paired with some interface. And then that interface describes how that thing should look and work when it gets aggregated. So this is how it knows, like, oh, I can treat all of these things the same. And so because this is dealing with events, it implements the event subscriber interface. And part of that interface, can I just like, slide. Whoopsie daisy. So if we go look at that interface, this is the Drupal API documentation. So all the stuff that you'll read in code, it gets generated into this website where you can browse around as well. By and large, I just prefer to read through the code, but for other people, they may prefer this. Look at the site. It only has one function in the interface, which is get subscribed events. And it returns an array of event names and the subscriber wants to listen to that are mapped onto functions to call in the object. So we'll go take a look at that. So get subscribed events on our Islandor JWT event subscriber. So there's a number of events which get generated by the JWT module that we want to listen to and do something when they get generated. So we set them as keys on the array and then assign function names to be called when those events get generated. And so the service, or sorry, the event dispatcher will use the service API to aggregate all the things with the service tag subscribe for events. And then when an event fires, it'll be like, hey, do you listen to this event? Do you listen to this event? Oh, you do. So it's going to then pass on the event to this particular instance that listens for it. And so if we look for one of the functions, say like validate, I should come in again. Don't hesitate to like yell that at me. There's a function in the class that's called validate. It takes the event as an argument, and then it just does something. We're not super concerned with that at the moment. That's just kind of the general way that events work and tags work and services work. So like to describe events, you have to talk about services. So, you know, everything bleeds into one another, but hopefully this is clear. If not, there's always room for questions later. Last of all and least, just look at the bit of code that actually fires the event. So this is coming from the JWT module. And whenever some request is being authenticated, it's zooming in. We have a new event being created here, validate, and then the event dispatcher is taking the name of the event, which we were listening to, and then passing in that event. And so that'll eventually end up at our listener. And so that's how that works. I'd mention, so the events dispatcher is reading through the service files, determining, you know, who has the tag event subscriber, who needs to be called. The thing that does that is called the compiler pass for the service container. I mean, this is a bit advanced, but nonetheless a little bit fun. So there's a class called register event subscriber pass, and basically what it does is whenever the service container is being built, and it's like, let me find all the services, and it goes and reads through all those YAML files, you can also register these compiler passes. And there's sort of a more dynamic way to find services and do things, but they're broadly used with the tag services. So in this case, it's saying, okay, look for anything that's tagged with event dispatcher. And I get in all the services that are event dispatcher services, and then checking if they implement the appropriate interface we just talked about, the event subscriber interface, to make sure they're valid for responding to this. And then it's saying, okay, let's build up a list of the subscribed events each of the services provide, and then map it back to that class so that whenever it goes to respond to one of those events, it doesn't have to like process the entire list again. It can just do a very quick lookup and be like, hey, you deal with this. So that's how that list gets built through the compiler pass. And there's links to the documentation on this tag here that describes how like all that stuff kind of works. So that's tags. You can also alter services. This is something we're currently doing in Islandora Core. So basically, you take a class that extends service provider base, and it has a function called alter, which allows you to alter the existing services. And we're going to take a look at Islandor service provider. Very small, not a lot to it. Let's zoom in. So basically what it's doing here is there's a context manager service provided by the context module, and we want it to behave differently. We want it to do something else slightly differently. So all we do is we say, don't use his, use or hers or theirs, use ours. And that's basically how it works. So anytime that context manager would have been inserted into some other service or used somewhere when someone tries to fetch it through the service container, they'll get our instantiation of Islandora context manager instead of what was originally set there. It's quite useful if you want to replace or override functionality. Swapping has a downside though, because you could have a bunch of modules that all want to manipulate one singular service, and they're like, oh, I should run, and then no, I should, and what have you. And you can't tell which one's going to win. It'd be depending on something like the module's install priority or something like that. It's totally not clear as to which one would be the one that gets used. So there's another method for doing this, which is called decorating, and I think I have a slide. Yes, I do on the next one. So yeah, so that's the downside of doing this. If you know in your installation, like I'm going to be the only one who's overriding this and I'm not installing any other modules that are, this is a perfectly fine way to do things. If you don't know that for sure, it's better to go with decoration. Some little notes there about gotchas, like with camel case, but yeah, it's not super interesting. So yeah, you can decorate instead. So basically what this does is you declare a new service that then depends on the existing service, and you set a priority that says, I should be first or third or something, but it's a very vague number, like somewhere between 0 and 100. And then the priority is used to construct them. And when you're doing this construction, though, they'll have to take the previous service, or the one that you're all kind of decorating, as the primary argument to their constructor. So they just get nested. So you see something like baz bar foo. So we have the service that's composed of two decorators, baz and bar, and they decorate the core service foo. That's not clear. So say you had an event subscriber and you wanted it to behave slightly different but still do mostly the same thing. You could create your own that listens and overwrites the existing one, but then say another module could do that as well. Something fundamental, maybe like reading and writing files, or some event that is like really down low, you might want to take this approach because there'd be multiple modules that would want to use or override the service. Last but not least, I think, not last. Let's see, 46. I'll try to go faster. What's not defined? Yeah, so not everything is defined in the services.yaml file. That is a service. Things like controllers and forms, they're done kind of by convention instead. What they do is they take a container injection interface, which says you must provide a create function. And then the create function takes the service container we talked about before. And within it, it just chooses the names of the things it wants to call and bring into its constructor. So for example, in Islandora core, we've got media source controller. And here's the bit that's interesting. So it has the create function that takes the service container, and then from the container, it's going to get our media source service, the database, and Islandor Utils services, and they get passed into the constructor. So very similar, just not YAML. It's done through an interface. By and large, this isn't the preferred way to do it. They prefer you to use the YAML file, but for some things like controllers, forms, and blocks, there's no way to do it via the YAML file. You should do it in this particular method. There's a bunch of traits that make it easier to use the container injection interface that give you access to the logger, something for messaging, translating strings, etc. The most sort of gotcha thing with these is with the string translation trait, there is a protected property which you should assign from the constructor. Ooh, I shouldn't have clicked. But yeah, that it's described in the documentation, and that's kind of like the only exception. The rest of them you can just kind of include and use. Stuff about services, this is really fundamental to the thing, but we don't need to talk about any of these ones. So there's like dynamic services, which allow you to dynamically create them at runtime, so that there's no compiler paths or any of that sort of stuff. It's just like you're adding it to the service container. Don't use it. I've never seen it used. We've talked about compiler passing, which is probably the most useful of all these. And synthetic services. Services defined at runtime. Oh yeah, I may have had those. Yeah, backwards. Yeah, I had those backwards. Services, yeah. But anyways, you're not going to use any of this stuff. Links for if you're interested. Plugins. Lots of plugins. There's lots of plugins. More old memes. So basically, it's a small chunk of code. You want to be able to use reuse functionality, and they can be swapped in and out. Plugins have a type, like a block or access check or what have you, and we're going to look at a couple. There's a method of discovery for them and a way to create them, so a factory. Generally, discovery and factory are all encapsulated in a singular class, and unless you're writing your own plugins, you can pretty much ignore those two things and only worry about typed ones. There's some additional concepts, which is derivatives, which is useful for dynamically creating plugins. The only place I've ever had to do this is with blocks, in particular like facet blocks for search, because you don't want to write 10 different plugins for the different facets you have. You create a derivative class that allows you to dynamically create a block for every facet that exists, so it's like driven by data. The links in the documentation there is useful. I've not used the decorator, but it's the same concept as we talked about before with services. And mapper, set of options to known plugins. Never used it, don't quite know how it works. Anyways, if you want to look it up, there you can read. Actually, that one's not in the documentation. That's why I don't have a link. Another complaint for documentation Drupal. There's only like vague mentions of it in the code comments. The way you'll interact with plugins generally is going to be through annotations. So annotations are a big thing in Drupal. These are used for discovery. They require you to have a unique identifier for that type. Different types of things can share the same identifier, but like they probably won't anyways. But for a singular type of thing like blocks, each block plugin has to have its own unique identifier. There's some additional type metadata that goes along with that. We'll look at an example. Field formatter. So this is responsible for displaying a field on an entity, which may not make any sense, but hopefully we'll later when we talk about entities. You got to introduce one thing at a time. So the image formatter is going to present an image to the user. It has a unique name. Let's zoom in. A unique identifier, Islandor image, some additional metadata like label with this little translation annotation, which means when this gets written out and displayed to the user, you'll be able to have multiple translations of this string for the different languages if you provide them. The field types it applies to, so this only applies to the image field type, and some additional stuff I'm not quite sure what quick edit does. But that's generally your anatomy of an annotation right there. It's going to be on the class of the plugin or the thing that it is annotating. You won't see them on functions, just classes. It's not as Java-y, where like annotations are used for all sorts of stuff.
So quick edit is for whenever you've been an admin on a site and you see this little circle pencil icon for allowing you to click it and just it'll open up the editor right there. That's what it's talking about. So it says quick editor, when you want to edit this thing, what editor should it open?
Yeah, there's a chain of functionality between this. So like this is a plugin that extends an already existing plugin, which is a common pattern. We're not really going to go into it. There's a bunch of links. And then as before, same with like the event subscriber, like there's certain interfaces that it needs to respect to be considered a particular plugin type. Is it 11:30 that we wrap up or 12? 12, okay. And I'm on slide 27. 100. Okay, because I think for the second bit, we might not be at the debugging section, right? Because I think we still got like, okay. These as well as to dig in a bit more.
Yeah, I would skim routing.
Okay. So, yeah, so let's take an example of context definitions like node has parent. So it's an associative array of annotations that require a specific data type. We'll talk about it a little bit later, hopefully. Objects are required for the plugin to be evaluated. So let's take a look at the sample code. at condition. So in this case, condition is a plugin type. So you get that sort of structure. Oh yeah, sorry, thanks. Context definition. And so here it takes a node, and we're saying that it must be of entity type node. It's required when this condition is used, like for this thing to be present. And if we were to zoom out, see, it says get context value node, and you get the node object, and then you can do something with it. And basically, that's what's being described here, something to be passed in. So the plugin only works when you have the context there. So a node, taxonomy term, user, something else, you specify it here in the context conditions. Now, what this is being used for, node has parent, I believe is often used on blocks. So I only want this block to show when I'm aware that this node has a parent object. That's good. Seth's going to talk about some of those Islandor properties like has parent and what have you in a moment, but that's kind of the basic gist. You need to provide something there. Yeah, creating custom types. I'm just going to skip over this. There's good links there that describes how it all works. Service definition, which refers to the thing, and then an interface for the thing, the annotation for the thing. So like at archiver, like before we seen at condition, that's the idea, and then implementation. So if you have time later, you can kind of like go through some of that. With routing, another meme. Little chuckle? No? All right. Not found. Basically, this is the layout. It's pretty simple. So a request comes in from the browser or from curl or from whatever. It hits the kernel, and then it's going to go through all the routes that have been set up and determine which controller should respond to that event. And then the controller is responsible for returning HTML, JSON, or some status code, like 404 if it fails. Creating a new route. So very similar to services, we have a routing.yaml file. They define the route path, the alias, the controller, who's going to respond to it, and how to create the controller. Yeah. And generally, the controller is going to return a rendable array for anything that's HTML based. I think actually it might be able to work for JSON as well. I mean, it depends on the things. But like, we'll look at some code that'll make it a bit clearer. All controllers have to use controller base as their base class. And they also follow a certain convention. So if you're looking for controllers, they'll be under source, folder name controller, and then the name of the controller.php. And they must follow the same namespace pattern of Drupal, module name, controller at the top level namespace. So one example we've got from Islandor is system-admin config Islandor. Let's take a look at this. So this is basically just the administration form, the route for that declaring that it exists. So we have the path where you would find it. So admin config Islandor. If I were to go to the website and type that in, go admin. Plugged in. That'll do it. See this route, right? Where the two options. This is the menu block page. So it's not the form. There's two forms inside of it. The next one down is the actual form. But this is the menu page where you have two links to two different forms. And so in the default section, the controller is defined. So this is the class that'll get instantiated and respond to the request and return the renderable array. We can specify a title there. And additionally, there's some options and requirements. In this case, we say you have to have the permission, access administrative pages to get to this route. That's the main method by which you restrict. Hi, Luke. Not super familiar because I was vacationing at the time. We can talk about that maybe a bit more in the question section. Do you want to get up for the mic though?
Yeah, I'll come up for the mic.
Repeat the question too.
Yeah.
So someone pointed out that an example of why this is important came with a recent security release that we had for Islandora, what had happened is in the code, someone had commented out the permissions, which would made testing a lot easier, but then left it there, which allowed anyone to have access to this root that allowed users to upload whatever file they wanted to the server. Yeah, so permissions, keep them. They're very important because they help protect your site.
Yeah. I'm not going to follow all the links now, but like there's the class system controller that was mentioned here. So system controller, and then the function system admin menu block page. So that's the class that gets instantiated and called, and that's the function that gets called, the callback, and then it returns an renderable array by calling some protected function inside called get block contents. For each route in routing.yaml, you're going to see the following properties generally: path and defaults. These ones are required. Methods would be like get, post, push, put. Sorry. Requirements is required, oddly enough, and options. There's a lot of properties and things. The documentation goes into sort of greater depth for a lot of this stuff. So all of those. Defaults is sort of the thing you're broadly the most interested in, aside from requirements permissions, as Seth just mentioned, where you need to specify what's going to deal with this response. Generally, it's going to be a controller, but there's like some convenience ones as well that do some of the handling for you. So like form, entity view, entity list, entity form. These allow you to pass sort of like a specialized class for like dealing with the rendering and processing of a form and not worry about the rest of the response. Whereas controller essentially gives you the full, it's your responsibility to deal with the whole response. With the routing API, you can specify parameters that get converted into objects whenever your controller is called. So the curly braces in a parameter, so you can see, no, I can't highlight, like node, curly braces, node / edit is a route. In this case, the node in the curly braces is the parameter. So in this, your callback method on your controller has to use exactly the same name for the parameter for this to work. And what it'll do is it will take that node, create a node object, an entity, and then pass that as the parameter node instead of just the string for the node, which would be like a number 1, 2, 3, whatever its identifier of the node is. And then you'd be responsible for creating that entity. So it handles that bit for you, and nicely it caches. So oftentimes you'll have a singular route that'll have a bunch of other links and things going on that require access to that object, and it'll only load it the once and they get shared everywhere, so it's a bit faster. Yeah, so this is param converting interface, and it's registered by the service tag param converter we've seen earlier. So you probably won't have to ever write one, but you will use one in this case. Yeah, so that's the broad strokes of that. Access checks. So you've seen before that singular permission with a string, or you can have a list of strings that give you sort of explicit permissions the user must have to access that route. Sometimes you need a more complicated access check. Maybe there's dependencies between entities and you need to check its parent entity. If the user has access to that parent entity, it can see the child entity, and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's use cases, requirements, custom access. Oh yeah, so in your route, the requirements section does have a custom access option in which you can then provide this class. The alternate method, I believe, is for, well, I mean, some of these things are handled for you. Like if you were using the entity, like entity view or entity form, it's going to go and load the access checks for that entity before you do it anyway. So like you don't have to specify it in those cases. This is more so like if you're doing your own controller. We've got an example from Islandora, which is, I think, related to actually the problem. Was it attached file to media?
I think it was uploading content but not files. It was
Okay. Okay, so that's a different thing.
But yeah, it was still content. It's like,
See some of this clearly. So there's the custom access bit with the namespace of the class to instantiate that actually performs the check. So there is no permissions on this one. You don't get to see it. So in this case, it's exclusively relying on this access check to see if it can allow or disallow a user when they go to that particular route. If we go take a look at the function, attach media to access interface. This is going to be provided by the interface. Scroll up. They generally have these three arguments, which is the account and the route. Two arguments. Sorry, I can't count. Yeah, but that's not enforced by any interface. Basically, what it's doing is it says, okay, I'm going to get the parameter media. I'm going to check its parent node. And I'm going to check if I have access to update its parent node and I have access to create media, then I'm allowed to access this route. If neither of those things are true, then I don't have access to this route. So it's a bit more complicated than just saying the user has this permission. And then there's some additional advanced route checks. It follows the same basic pattern, but you can do a bit more with it. Another meme, sorry, Drupal Entities, another very old meme. I don't always want to add custom fields to things, but when I do, those things are not entities. It's really hard to find Drupal memes on the internet. I'm pulling at the bottom of the barrel here. So entities. This is probably the most Drupal-y Drupal thing in Drupal, because this is their sort of distinctive API that's different than a lot of others. And it's one that's really worth sinking your teeth into. It's a very large topic. We're not going to cover all of it. It's more complex than any of the APIs we've talked about so far because it uses every single one we've talked about so far, plus several others that we've not mentioned. It's a big difference between Drupal 7 and 8+. It's now part of core. Well, I guess it was part of core before, but in Drupal 7, you really couldn't use it without some contributed modules. And but the encapsulating idea here for an entity is that it's a piece of data. It's either some configuration or content, and we'll talk more a little bit about those distinctions. In many ways, it's a way to model functionality that requires data. So comments, there's a chunk of data, but it's also you can attach comments onto a post. A comment belongs to a user. So the comment would then have a field that links it to the user, that links it to the post. So there's ways that, and it has its own body of text that represents itself. So it's data and relationships between things, functionality and data together as an entity. Yeah.
So in the Zoom, there was a question about Drupal with model view controller. You can think of entities as your fat model. This is basically how you are structuring the data for a lot of the things that you do in Drupal, but a lot of the business logic is in here as well. So you think of it as a fat model when you're thinking about the MVC.
I guess we should probably add a bit more to that in the sense in the old MVC, you'd have a single thing you're viewing on a page that represents the model. Generally in Drupal, you've got lots of entities. So a single block is an entity. The node you're viewing is an entity. I believe in breadcrumbs are an entity. They might be, they might not be. No, I think I'm wrong on that one. But the menu links that are on the top of the page. So it's a bunch of things. It's not just sort of the base content you're viewing. But it's a really good sort of analogy for thinking about it. Things you care about, definitely fat model, the node, comments, that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's two types of entities. There's this division between them. Fundamentally, there could be more, but there really isn't. The base levels of the APIs are such that you really have to go down one of these two routes. There's content and configuration. The distinction between these two is largely where the data is stored and what you can do with it. Otherwise, they're quite similar in a sense. The use cases for both are quite a bit different. So like configuration uses the configuration system. So this is a way in which you can like configure your website. I'm saying that word so much it's losing its meaning. But yeah, there are things that you could pass between, say, your development environment and your production environment, like how you have the site configured is something you want represented in that way, but you may not want to move all the content, like all the posts the users created between all these different environments. So it provides the defaults for installations, for modules that you can then change. It supports translations via schema.yaml. This is a bit different than content, which just kind of supports it right out of the box. So if you go and create a content entity, you'll want to go read through some of this, sorry, not content, configuration entity, you'll want to read through some of this documentation I've linked here that describes how to enable translations for it. They don't get their own tables. They're all stored in a single table as separate rows. They're non-fieldable, which we'll talk about more when we get into content, but they use properties that you have to define. You can essentially think of them as just like a JSON object almost, just a chunk of data, not much in the way of functionality going on within the thing itself. They don't support constraints on fields either, because they're not fieldable. And you can import and export them via YAML. We'll show that in a minute in the website. So for content, this is sort of the bread and butter. This is your nodes, your comments, your Islandora repository item, like this is content. It supports base fields. So these sort of technical distinctions. So like in Drupal, you'll have a number of tables. I think we'll talk about this a bit more on the other slide. I'll leave that for the moment. They're optionally fieldable. They support database level constraints, this stuff like IDs need to be unique, or this field isn't nullable, like you can enforce that stuff at the database level. Additionally, you can add on field constraints. So this is sort of a higher level concept of not just a column of data in the database, but like something like an image or something like that. And you could say, oh yes, but no PNGs, thank you. We can't store PNGs with this. You could do something along those lines. Then there's additional entity level constraints where you could have constraints across two different fields. Say like when this field is present, this other field must be empty or something along those lines. Has support for revision, so you can see how it's changed over time and roll it back to a previous revision, and supports translations out of the box. Special note for bundles. So bundles are a variant of a content type. So like for nodes, we have basic page, article, Islandora repository item. These are all content types of the content type node. If that makes any sense. So this is a combination. So you have the core content type node, and then you have node type, which is a configuration type that describes the variations of a node that you can have. So, okay, the example here is like node type is a configuration type. Article is an instance of node type that derives or defines its variation of the node content type. It's a bit weird. It'll make more sense the more you mess with it. You define new entities via annotations, just like plugins, like almost everything in Drupal, really big on the annotations. There's a base class that's shared between the two types, entity type, so that's the shared functionality between the two. And then your content type that you define, or your config entity type that you define, they're going to descend from content entity type or config entity type. Those are the examples are node and node type. Let's talk about configuration entities a little bit first. So basically, you're going to create an interface that implements config entity interface. And then that's how you're going to pass around your config entity to things. You're not going to pass the core class or the root class of the thing, but the interface that class implements. It's generally the recommended way to do it. You'll create the actual concrete class, the config entity base. So for example, node type. You'll add an annotation. So let's go take a look at one. There's a lot here. We're not going to talk all about that at the moment. So this is node type. Zoom in. This is extending the config entity bundle base, and it implements the node type interface. So you create the type interface first that describes the functionality you want in terms of functions, and then you have the concrete type here. And then you use the config entity type annotation to then let Drupal know that, hey, this is a custom config entity type that I've created, make it available for use. Allow me to save and interact with it. Labels, for all sorts of situations when it's getting displayed as a collection, singularly, plural, what have you. Handlers, we'll talk about a little bit more later. The important ones for configs is config prefix. So in this case, it's going to be type. This is a bundle, so you also have to provide bundle of node. Config types don't have to be bundles. Some of them are just like module settings or whatever, so they wouldn't have this field. But this allows us to have the variations of nodes, the bundle of node. Entity keys. So there's some core keys that come with entities like ID, UUID, label, and this is just mapping those to the actual properties of the config type. So that whenever someone says, hey, give me the ID of this entity, it's going to actually look at the type field internally to give that sort of information. Routing. So if you wanted to edit this particular entity or delete it or what have you, we just have to specify the path along with some type parameters here. And the fancy little magic underneath is going to go create a route for us automatically and put it in all the places that you would expect. And last but not least, the most important part of this is config export. So this describes the properties of the type. So here we got type, name, description, and we see them all here in config export. So this is the bit that allows Drupal to know, oh, these are the fields I need to serialize out when I write to the config table or when I generate the YAML on disk. These are the ones that I actually use. Yeah, you add your properties to the config export fields. And the last bit here, number 5, that's really to deal with translation. So the node schema stuff I mentioned before. You should mention all the properties that you have in your config export field in the schema and then give them appropriate types. Oh, actually, let's look at node schema YAML. So here's an example. So for the node type, it's a config, let's zoom in. It's a config entity. We give it a proper label. This is the bit that's going to get translated whenever you go to apply different translations to the site. And then there'll be a mapping for each of the properties where you give the type and then the value to be translated. So name would be in this case. There's a couple of core types, Boolean, integer, Boolean. Providing these here allow it to know the appropriate way to serialize and deserialize to the YAML. If you don't provide these, it's going to treat everything as strings. Occasionally, that'll really bite you in the butt and cause problems, but sometimes it's fine. I mean, you can get away without doing this, especially if you never want to translate your site. But if you're going to write a module that you're going to share with other people, they may want to translate their site. So please keep your schema.yaml up to date. There's a full tutorial here I've linked at the bottom provided by Drupal on their wiki. Yeah, it's a worthwhile read. Content entities, very much in the same. You want to define an interface and then a base class that's concrete, and then populate the annotation. The slight difference now is that we actually have tables that we can interact with. So let's go look at node. Not all of these are relevant. So we've got node as our content entity type. So not config entity type, but content entity type. And table section. Let's zoom in. So when you go look at the database, you'll see a table called node, and that represents the base fields for this type. It's also fieldable, which means it can have separate, sorry, my bad, let me recorrect that. The data table in this case means it's translatable. I know this is not very clear, but it also says translatable to true here. But the data table means that it's going to create a separate table for maintaining the separate translation of the base fields. It's poorly named. Revision table is where multiple revisions of the content are kept. So when I create a new node and then I make an edit to that node, the previous values for that node will be moved into the revision table, and then the current values will live in the base table and its field tables. Okay. That's good. Handlers, I guess, would be this bit, and I can just kind of skip over the next bit. Handlers are very important. That's how you attach functionality onto your node. You can control how it's stored, how it's viewed, how it's accessed. So before, when we've seen node access update, like that's provided by this class here. If you want to be able to use it with views, you have to provide a views data handler. The various forms for adding, deleting dealing with them. Route providers, how the routes are generated from the links section down below. A list of them in translations, how these things are handled. So that's all provided by handles. There's documentation for it. Move on. Yeah, that was basically this slide. Configuration. Yeah, we talked about config entities. Now, there's a setting in settings.php that controls where the YAML goes for those configuration, where it's consumed from, where it's written from. So that's what the link here for on the second point is. All configuration is a key value pair. So typically module name followed by, type or settings or some denomination that kind of classifies what configuration you're dealing with. So like node type article is for the node type bundles. Islandor settings is for Islandor settings. Pretty straightforward. You can override them in settings.php. You don't have to provide things through YAML. Not all configuration is configuration entities. Some is just configuration. Some is just essentially JSON serialized out as YAML and consumed as YAML. It doesn't have an entity associated with it, like settings in particular. Yeah. Whenever you're setting up configuration for your module, there's a folder called config. It's got installed, optional, and schema. Install is what's going to be written by default into the config when the module gets installed. Optional will only be used if dependencies of the configuration also exist. And this schema bit we already talked about. Important ones is core extensions.yaml. This is the one you're going to look at a lot. So it's what modules are enabled on your site, what themes are enabled, and what install profile was used, along with the priorities for them. So the priorities would affect like which hooks get called first. Field storage, file field. So these are the fields on node or content entities, like in this case, node body. So you have a body field on a node that can then be associated with, say, like an article node type. And then when you fill that out, the storage describes how that's stored, and then the field describes how it's like presented and dealt with. Settings.yaml files you see a lot for all the different modules. Config has no UI to change, which is a real pain in the butt. So like if you want to change the RDF mapping for something, you're going to have to go and manually edit that YAML and re-import it. But for the most part, things have a UI. You won't have to actually write YAML yourself. There's a bunch of modules that are super useful for dealing with configuration. Devel in particular allows you to like look through it and see what's going on. Diff, you can diff between two configuration entities. Features is like packaging up configuration and sharing it. Don't use it, just don't. Config ignore and config split allow you to ignore configuration when importing or exporting, or split it up into different sort of environments. You could have like a dev configuration, a production configuration. Config override allows you to override config. Many more. There's a list of like 50 or 80. Important Drupal modules. I'm just going to skip through. Users are users, nodes, files, media. Please go read those later. And taxonomy. For Drupal module development, basically all you need is an info.yaml file at the very minimum. It describes like the name, a little basic metadata about your module, and a composer.json that says, hey, this is how I can be installed, and these are my dependencies. After you get that, you can actually add functionality that will live under the source folder, by and large. The structure of the folder should match the namespaces for the classes so that you get auto-loading correctly. So it'd be like source, controller, controller's name, and then your class name would be like Drupal, your module name, controller, class name. Well, yeah. Then there's a bunch of top-level YAML files you'll see a lot of. There's libraries.yaml, routing.yaml, linkactions.yaml, many more. I've posted some links to where you can read about how those things work. They're all described in the module, or sorry, in the documentation. And there's a little tutorial that'll walk you through creating your first module at that link.
So normally we would spend the rest of the period up to the lunch going through this next section, but because we only have about 11 minutes before that break, and we do want to be mindful of people on Zoom needing to take breaks as well, we're gonna compress what was left for this morning into the afternoon as well, so we have time to talk about it. So we'll take questions in just a minute. for anything that you might have. But as a brief overview of where we're going to go on next when we get back from lunch, the next section is really talking about what are the Islandora specific peculiarities that we have in the Islandora community. What's important about the Islandora module that makes it Islandora? So we're going to talk about some of these things like the member of concept that we have, how we've used media, although there's been a slight shift towards how we're doing that. So we'll get into that. Also contexted events, which enables a whole bunch of other things. And this slide was not updated appropriately because not only are we going to talk about JSON LD and JWT, but we'll also start talking about alpaca and crayfish and the other things when we get back. So I will get into that when we get back from lunch. After we talk about the Islandora specific stuff, we'll start talking about debugging stuff and how do you follow things through the stack and figure out what's going on. So that said, as a preview, we just have a few more minutes for any questions that you might have about Drupal stuff specifically so far. And I've been trying to monitor the Slack, the Zoom chat. So hopefully I've got everything there, but if Nigel, you can see if there's any more questions that people have. Questions, comments, concerns, accusations? Yes. Yes, and I did post it on the Zoom, and I may have posted it to the Slack. Anyway, if you see me, either see the Slack or see me, and I can get it for you as well. Yeah, because like Nigel said, there's a whole bunch of. Okay. Yeah. Sweet.
We can't hear what's being said in the room, so you might want to repeat.
While you're thinking, I'm going to mention. Oh yes, another one. Yeah. So the question was, when you are starting to get into it, how do you know, because things overlap so much, how do you know where to start when you're trying to accomplish a particular task? Yeah, you don't. When it works is when you've ended. But Nigel, why don't you comment
Yeah, I
as
mean,
well?
like, I'd second that. Yeah, you broadly don't. I think it's really good to like go read the core modules, like the ones I had the links there at the end, like node, taxonomy, what have you, because they'll encapsulate everything, and they do a better job of it than most community or contrib modules do. So like stuff like caching, right? It's important to do. I didn't do that right at the beginning until someone points it out, like, hey, this isn't caching properly, and then I go and find out about the caching API and read about how that works. Unfortunately, that's just kind of how it is, unless you want to sit down and like dedicate like 2 weeks to just reading through docs and code. It's an incremental process, and that's totally fine.
Yep.
You know?
Another thing I would say is it always starts with what you're trying to do, right? And finding something that is similar enough that it can be a launching point for you. With a lot of Islandora development, we have a lot of the core stuff that we're trying to do done. A lot of what we need to do with Islandora is extend what we already have, which means there's probably a jumping off point that you can go from and figure it out, what's here. Let me understand exactly what's happening here, and reading the bits that relate to that. Like if you see it's outputting a form, well, maybe I should read the form API. There's a lot of Islandora is building forms, actually. For when you look at the code base, a lot of it is forms. There's a good bit of routing and services. But that's really where to start, is what are you trying to do? And is there something that touches on that I need to jump into? How does it work? So that I can then build on that or alter it or do it some slightly differently. Does that help? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so for the recording, to repeat what Alan just said, Drupal Console, which we will talk about after lunch. So there's your hook to make sure you're in this section after lunch, we will talk about Drupal Console and creating that boilerplate for moving forward for when you're just starting creating a module, for example.
One written question, and Kerry's been raising his hand, but I'm not
Okay.
sure like how we give him the mic or something. I'm not sure how that works with Zoom.
I think he can unmute himself and talk. I don't know that we'll
Yeah,
be
I
able to hear it.
I can't, I just want to say that, you know, after doing Drupal for 17
Is our
years
speaker?
now, can you hear me?
With the HDMI, I might be trying to
Okay.
play it out of my speaker.
Can you hear me? No, you can't.
Yes.
hear me.
we
there
can hear
go.
you
Okay,
now.
yeah.
Okay, great. So, I mean, after doing Drupal for like 17 years, my approach to building modules is to find anything that's even vaguely close, run it, change all the references in it to a new name, and then start developing for there, because that saves a ton of time.
And see what broke when you change the names.
Wow, yeah, yeah. I'm
Absolutely.
not saying that this like instantly lets you write a new module. I'm just saying
Yeah.
that it just gives you a leg up, which is not to say that you shouldn't read. I mean, I learned Drupal when there was no documentation, but the code was really well documented, which it still is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I completely agree with what Kerry said, because I've done that countless times myself.
Same.
Yeah. That's standard practice, kind of. What was the written one, Nigel?
Where I work, they use Oracle Linux as a
To repeat for the recording really quick, again, the question was best Linux distribution for working with Islandora and the stack. It was commented that most of the community is steering towards Debian because of more recent updates. Also, the Oracle and the Red Hat tend to be more locked down and tend to have older versions that may not work as well, especially when it comes to Docker support.
They even have a different version.
Yeah, to repeat that for the recording, basically watch your distribution, especially when you're using the manual install or the Ansible, because a lot of those dependencies matter a lot more because you're not abstracting that into the Docker container, and you will need to make sure that the particular distribution you're using has the Apache or has the PHP that you need to do that. I have manually installed on CentOS a number of years ago, and that was a real pain because you had to bring in EPEL and REMI and these other packages repositories to be able to build it at all. So yeah, be careful. Although a lot of this community is using usually Debian based, Ubuntu, that sort of thing. It is now noon, so we will probably end the recording. We will start back up. We get done. Remember, is it at 1 that we're starting back up? But I hope you all join us where we'll talk about more Islandora specific parts of the stack, and also how to debug and work with those different components as the developer. Yes, we will see you all in 1 hour at 1 o'clock. Enjoy your lunch. Started, folks. We have time here. Welcome back, everybody, to the technical track of IslandoraCon 2022 for the developer workshop. The first half this morning, Nigel took us through a whole bunch of the Drupal ecosystem, talked about the various APIs and components, where things are, which I think is really foundational for understanding the components that are Islandora, because we're extending a lot of those things. And while I'm talking about the Islandora specific pieces, I wanted you to have at least seen some of these pieces and where they fall into place. So let's get started here. Right here on the screen, the Islandora module is basically just a tree listing of all the different pieces that we have in the Islandora module. And I am going to shift, I guess we have the presenter thing here. Can we hide this at all? Oh, well. Anyway, actually, I might be able to move this elsewhere. Okay, sorry about that. It's obscuring part of the screen. So when you create a module in Drupal, there's a number of things that are required, but not all that many. The one thing that's really required in the Islandora module is this islandora.info.yaml, which basically says, hey, I'm an Islandora module, and these are the core versions of Drupal I support, and here are some of the things that are required, other modules that are required for me. So when it comes to a module, that's essentially it. That's required for you to say, I'm a module. Everything else is just dependent on what you're trying to do with it. And we're not going to go through all of this because, like I said, there's a whole lot here. We could spend all week going into detail about all the different pieces, but I wanted to highlight a few of the different things to reference them because you got an idea of what they looked at earlier. So for example, we talked about routing, deciding, okay, when Drupal sees this particular URL for the site, which controller should I be using? We've added a few for Islandora, so you see that in routing. We have a few services that you can instantiate, one of which is the Islandor Utils, which becomes, when you're developing with Islandora, becomes really critical in a lot of cases, but those services are defined in the YAML that pulls you to other parts of the actual classes, the PHP classes that are in here. I don't have, of course, all the individual classes in a lot of these because there would be a whole lot here. But I wanted you to get familiar with this structure that we have. We also have a number of sub-modules. So within this module, we have other modules that even further down break into smaller components, some of these pieces. And we will make references to some of these a bit later. We mentioned, of course, the controllers with the routing API. We've also referenced plugins, where we have quite a few plugins that we're using in Islandora. But to give you a better idea of what's going on here, I wanted to point out a few, what I call Islandora-isms, that aren't really truly Drupal ideas, or things that we've added to our module of Islandora. And did I accidentally skip one ahead? No, I guess I did in this order. One of them is this concept of media of. With Drupal, when you're creating a node, such as an article or a basic page, it'll have a field that could be a reference to a media. And basically, media is a bunch of metadata wrapped around some sort of file that's attached to it. So you can imagine an image file is attached to this media entity, which is just description about that image. And so if you were creating in a blog post and you said, I want this image, you would attach a reference to that media that has that file. So you have not only the picture, but also some descriptive, maybe some caption in there, whatever it might be. In Islandora, we flip that around to where we have media that reference a node instead. We call it by default our repository item. It could be really any node that it references. And that's this concept that is kind of inverted from the way that Drupal normally thinks about media. We flipped it the other way around, saying media are going to point to the node. The reason why we did this is we wanted to be able to say that a media, that the description that we're trying to have, the node, which is much more robust than normally you would see on a media, can apply to different versions of the same media. So for example, I have a TIFF file that I've scanned. That's my original file. And I'm going to have another media that's going to be a display image, and another one that's going to be a thumbnail. And being able to say each of those apply to this node allows me to have all these very related media attached to this one description. So this is a bit of an oddity. So we've done a number of things to make this work together, including adjusting things like routing to be able to add media to a node. We've done things like shifting, altering some views to allow you to control how you're viewing these objects. And again, of course, we have quite a bit of plugins here, including how we display those images. In this example, we go to Islandora Image Formatter. You can see on the screen there what this does, and I, of course, didn't link it. So let me pull this up really quick. Of course, these are not my history, and not my keyboard either. Under Islandora, we're going to go in here to our source, to our plugins, to our field formatter. Oh wait, of course it would help if I went to, yep, Islandora Image Formatter. So we talked about how a lot of the things that we're doing include annotations. Oh, yep, zoom in, thank you. So this plugin is specifically for dealing with fields. And in this case, a field formatter. This is more Drupalisms when you're talking about a bit of data that an entity can own. We talk about it as a field, and they're defined in multiple ways. But in this case, this plugin formatter defines how we want to display that particular field. And in this case, what we're doing is we're defining the fact that, yes, it's going to be for images, as was mentioned earlier. And we have the constructors to do the dependency injection, et cetera, et cetera. But then we're going to do a few interesting things here, in that we're going to grab this item. Where is it? Right here. We're going to ask which node this media belongs to. So we're going to take that relationship that we have between the media and the node, we're going to grab it, and we're going to change the URL that it's linking to. So when you view this image in Drupal, normally when you would click on it, it would say, go to that media, because I want to view that media. We're rewriting it to say, no, actually, we want to go look at the node that it's associated with. We've written a formatter to take this relationship and use it to replace the URL that would normally be used to link with. This is one of the ways that we can use things like plugins with, relatively few lines of code to change the default assumptions that Drupal has about how things are related to each other. Because again, the standard image formatter would say, hey, I'm going to use the URL to link it to that media page. We're going to take it and instead use it to redirect to that parent. I'm also going to point out, and these are not my keys. Here we had in our, did we use dependency injection for this one? I guess not. There it is, getting lost in here. One of the things that we inject is this handy little service called Islandor.Utils. I mentioned briefly earlier that you can get a lot of use out of this, and you'll see this injected in a lot of places in the Islandora code base, because this provides a number of different little helpers, such as, given a particular media, get me the node that's related to it. So to introduce you to that, and here's one of the other things, when you see something like that, if you're going into a formatter and you're trying to figure out what's going on here, and you see, oh, hey, I have in fact, if I was just cold reading this, I would see this utils. Well, what's this utils? Where is this coming from? I would, of course, go to the utils, and this actually shows me what class this is. And I would also know that it's being set up in my constructor coming from create. Again, understanding that what's happening here is dependency injection. I know that I can probably learn a little bit more about this by going to my services. Jumping down to Islandora services. There is my Islandor Utils. You'll notice that it also has, zoom in. It's also pulling in a lot of other services. So you can see how you've almost chained a lot of these requirements to get what you're looking for. But let's go take a peek at Islandor Utils, because it is a handy one to be familiar with. There's been a number of times where someone submitted a pull request for new code, and one of my comments is, oh, by the way, instead of recreating this, we have a function that already does that in the utils. So let's clean up the code a little bit by going and using this helper over here, because there are very common things that you want to do over and over and over again. So source, Islandor Utils, which happen to be mostly in terms of media relationships and the member of, which I'm also going to introduce here in a moment. But there you can see the dependency injection again. But things like get parent node of the media, which it's looking for particular fields that it's looking for before it returns it, using all the other services that we've included here. But there's get parent node, there's get media related with item, get media that has a particular term on it. All sorts of handy little things where you don't want to have to rewrite these queries and these lookups and using the entity type manager over and over and over again to use. All right. We go even further. I had mentioned these submodules for Islandora. These are also related to actually, I needed to take off the advanced search one, but really your Islandora audio, your image, your text extraction, and your video all further this concept of let's create a formatter for these different types of media that we're working with in Islandora, right? So not only have we extended it to, in this plugin, we've also done additional ones in these. So you'll want, when you're starting to work with Islandora, you'll want to start to get familiar with how things stack together. How we started with this core idea that we've modified how Drupal works, but then we're going to stack onto it and stack onto it a little bit more and a little bit more. Actually, did you spin up that? I closed your test site link. To get a view of this, we're logged in. So for example, sample image here is a node. You can see that because it says node/2 in the URL. And one of the things that the media of code that we have includes adding a tab here for looking at the related media. This is not something you would see in a standard Drupal site, because it would be the other way around. You would have a field that points to the media. So if you look in your media, we have additional buttons that are also defined by those routes. The batch upload media is another route that's defined for controlling how we can batch add media. So these this is the reason why we have this, all this code is to support the fact that this item has a sample image, which is an original file, but we also generate a service file and a thumbnail that are both related to this item that we have here. Any questions about the media of? I mean, I started at the assumption that everyone would at least have the basic view of that user interface for this. So hopefully I'm not leaving anyone behind there. Any questions from the Zoom that you know? Okay. All righty. So do get familiar with those, and I will come back to things like condition a little bit later. Another Islandoraism that you'll see a lot of code of in the core Islandora module is this idea of member of, where we know that nodes can be related to each other. You do this in Drupal with fields that have references to other nodes, just like we have references to taxonomy terms or to media. We have a special relationship called member of in Islandora that implies a parent relationship. So this item belongs to this particular group. That item can belong to another group that can chain up, which is actually kind of silly to me that Drupal doesn't have this built-in assumption somewhere in there, but you know, we like it, we have it. But we also have a number of routes and services that support this concept. So let's actually go back to our routing. Things like add member to node page. So if you go to sample image and you click on children, we have this little add child button. Well, we're gonna have to do some custom coding to tell the controller how do we want to create this relationship through this form. We've done that by saying, hey, if you get this path of node reference members add, which if you hover over that, you can see there in the bottom left-hand corner, I know you can't really see it from here, it's very small, but you can try it on your own. There's that path. And so Drupal knows when you click on that button to see that route, we're going to go and use the controller, manage members controller, add to node page, which is going to do some custom logic for saying, hey, you know, yes, we're going to go to the create node page, but we're also going to auto-populate this member of field with a reference to the current node, right? And the title, we're also going to add a title to it. Of course, we need to have some requirements such as, do we have the entity create any access to nodes? We need to be able to edit nodes to be able to use this route, right? Because security is important. Another thing that I might as well mention while I'm here, but can be handy to know, the admin root. Drupal will have two interfaces running at the same time, two themes, I should say, running at the same time. One for everybody who's looking at it, and then another one for the administrators. And you can get some interesting display issues depending on which theme you're using to view something with. I find that the admin view has a much cleaner views page. So when it displays tables of content that you're working on for managing things, the admin interface is a lot cleaner. But this option here says we want to use the admin interface for this particular route, is what this is doing. That's our routing. We have, again, it was referencing this controller, manage members controller. And we're also going to be making a lot of use of the Islandor Utils. For example, and I do call this out in this slide, the fact that this is one thing that we've hard coded. You need to have a field called field member of. That's what we use for this ancestry relationship, and it is hard coded here. But also means that if we do ever change this, you can still reference Islandor Utils member of field, and you'll always know what field that you're supposed to be looking at. Granted, you are probably going to be using other functions such as the find ancestors, which will walk those relationships for you. So you can say with this helper function, you say, I have this node, find me all of the parents. So it'll jump to the parent, say, okay, who's its parents? It'll jump to the next one. Who's its parents? Jump to the next one. And we use this to build out breadcrumbs, and also other things as well, if I remember correctly. Which, again, modules, we have, you may or may not want breadcrumbs, but we have a module here that uses that find ancestors helper to be able to build breadcrumbs that way if you want to use it. It's not something you have to have, so you can uninstall that module if you want to, but it is there if you want it. Another thing that we've done to pull some of the field configuration out of Islandora Core is we have this Islandora Core feature submodule, which is the actual field configurations and view configurations that make a lot of this work as well. Which is why when you're installing Drupal, installing Islandora from scratch, if you're not using Isle or a playbook, one of the steps is to not only enable the Islandora module, which you can do on its own, but if you want that member of support, you can also enable the Islandora Core feature module, which will install the fields and the views necessary to really use this feature moving forward. We also have a number of conditions which are related to ancestry as well, and I will again come back to conditions when we go through another example moving forward. But there's these two concepts that are really purely Islandora concepts. One, the fact that we have media referencing a node, and also that we have nodes that have a degree of ancestry. So we'll put items in a collection, and that collection can belong to a parent collection, and that collection can belong to another parent collection. And another reason why you might want to pay attention to using the helper functions is, one, you don't want to have to rewrite that walker, but we've also built in conditions that check for circular parentage, which if you weren't thinking about that and started to write your own and didn't bring that consideration in, you might actually break your site. We've already done it. We've already broken our sites and then added the check for it so that you can reuse that. And there's additional helpers in Islandor Utils as well. Question about the member of at all? Doing okay? Okay. So at this point, we're going to jump outside of Islandora, the module, right? Because we have additional things that are part of the Islandora community, but not part of that core Islandora module, to defaults, controlled access terms, and JSON LD. Islandora defaults was really intended to be a configuration for an example Islandora site, saying, you know, we know this is not core. We're not saying you have to do all these things. You don't have to have all these fields, but this is what a lot of us are doing. This is one of the things that you could do with your repository. It has become de facto Islandora though, because a lot of sites will still use the content types that's defined here. They'll still use the fields that are defined here. They'll still use a lot of the stuff that's in here. But none of that is strictly required for it to be an Islandora site per se, right? It also provides some integrations based on the default configs, such as Mirador support, which is a large image viewer, pan and zoom viewer, or a paginated page viewer. And also the search module assumes that you're going to be searching based off of the fields that we've defined. That said, there has been some discussion in the community about the role of Islandora defaults and the submodules in it. So that is something that's subject to further evolving of the community as we decide, you know, how we want to push out recommended configurations to the community. Related to that is controlled access terms, which was originally designed to provide common taxonomies and for Islandora and other Drupal sites. a little bit more background on this. I wrote this module in part because I knew going forward that I would need something that had the same taxonomies to support both our Islandora for our digitized content and also descriptions coming from an archive space integration I was writing. And so I didn't want to have these taxonomies live in one place or the other. I wanted to be able to share them between the two. And so I created a separate module that could be used by either. That was since adopted by the Islandora community. So yes, write your own modules, and if the community finds it useful, we may adopt it. Not everything does. I will caveat that saying, not everyone does. We use quite a few things in the community that aren't technically under the Islandora umbrella yet, but are well adopted by the community anyway. So I'm not saying give us your code. I'm saying write code, we'll use it if we find it useful. But that's what controlled access terms started as, was a set of configurations for taxonomies that made sense for things like what's a person, what's a corporate body, what's a subject, what's a geographic location, for defining those in a Drupal site. It grew to include some other useful things that you find in defaults. Type relation, which I'll get into in a moment. I'll get into all three of these here in a moment. Extended datetime format, and also the authority link field. And wrong keyboard. There we go. So let me describe type relations for you a little bit. Drupal already had this concept of creating a reference between two things, right? You could already say, hey, this node is related to that node. We saw that with the field member of that we were just talking about. One of the things that we didn't have with that was the ability to say, what kind of relationship is it? So for example, why might this be important? We were looking at our own descriptions that we had, and we had people who were related to each other. This is a person's spouse. This is a person's child. This is the employer. This is that, or the other. We were using an ontology that had like 32 different types of relationships between people. Now, the standard way to do that in Drupal would be to add a different field for each one of those relationships. And frankly, I didn't want to build a form that had 32 different fields just for the relationships between people, right? So I created this field to say, hey, yes, it's a relationship, but I want to add another property to this field that says, what kind of relationship is it? So you can go in and you can say, hey, I'm going to create a typed relation field. So you'll note, you go to the source of controlled access terms, plugins, field type, it's typed relation. And I didn't even have to write all this myself. This extends the entity reference item. So actually, if we jump to, open a new tab. Not my keyboard. Up to your source. Like we said, plugins everywhere. A lot of what we do is in plugins. Field type relationship. Of course, we have to have our annotations to talk about what it is. Zoom in. Indeed. So it's a type relationship. It has the label, which you actually see displayed. That's where this label came from, was that definition in the source code. But also that it extends the existing reference field. And all I'm really doing is adding a new property to it. It's going to be a relationship type. It's going to be a small bit of text. And I do things like, okay, when you have a form that describes how to use this. So this little form right here is when you hit, it's not the edit button, it's actually clicking the typed relationship for this field. And you go into the form, there's this available relations box right here. Well, actually, let me go back to here again. This vocabulary listing is a listing of the different things that I could be referencing with this field. So I could be referencing a corporate body or a family or a country or a person, and I can select which of the vocabularies I want it to be able to use. I didn't have to write this because this was already included in the entity relationship field. All I needed to add, and hide that for all I needed to add was the relationship type, and in the form, I'm going to say, hey, parent, being the entity relationship type, build that form for me, and I'm just going to add my own text box here, my own text area. But I probably also want to validate it to make sure that it actually works. So I add down here, where is it? A validation. And I have some other helpers in there as well. Make it work. So by using a plugin and using a little bit of inheritance, I can just briefly extend what already exists in Drupal to make it a little bit better for us. I will say there is one gotcha with this that I didn't realize when I started, because sometimes you learn things going on. Actually, ideally, always keep learning things. When it came to other modules, we'll make assumptions about what you're using. And so if you have a module that does something to extend or builds on the entity reference field, they may actually look and see what the ID is and see that it's, if they don't see that's entity reference here, it won't use it. The example that I have for this is the term merge module, which we're like, hey, this is great. There's this module that already exists to be able to merge two terms that should be the same thing together. Well, it didn't work for us. And the reason being is because it was explicitly looking for entity reference fields, not things that extended it. So you do have to be careful sometimes that you also don't do something that bites you. I think it's still worth using this for the use cases that we have for it. I would have done it again. It's one of those things where, one of these days I may eventually get around to a pull request to fix term merge, but we'll see what happens with that. But that is a gotcha. Sometimes other modules make assumptions, which may not necessarily be true with your extensions. If they had instead checked to make sure that it was meeting entity reference items interface instead, then it would have worked. So that's another thing. Always check interfaces. That's why we have them, rather than keying off of things like the ID. Right. So anyway, that's the typed relationship, the field type. We also have plugins for widgets to say, hey, how do I want users to do data entry? Is your widgets. And also formatters, how do I want to display this to the end user? The first one we did was typed relation formatter, which simply just went through and listed each of them with the relationship being displayed. The dedupe formatter was someone saying, hey, I have a person who has multiple relationships, and I don't want to list them twice. I just want to list the person one time and their relationship twice next to them, which is fine. It's a perfectly legitimate way to think about wanting to display your stuff, same data, slightly different display. So they created a different formatter to say, hey, give me the data, but we're going to restructure it a little bit to display it a little bit differently. So you'll see this quite a bit as well, where people will say, hey, I don't want to muck with the data. The data is good. I just want to restructure it a little bit in its display. We'll create a field formatter plugin. And when you're looking at your display configurations, you can just choose which formatter you want to use. Related is authority link. This is another extended field that we created. Authority link just extends the already existing link field that Drupal provides with, again, just another added field. In this case, it's a list of authorities that it came from. That said, this was like a concept that really hasn't been fully utilized yet. So yes, we store what we can store, what taxonomy, what vocabulary, I should say, this particular item was sourced from, but we don't really do anything actionable with it yet. But if you wanted to, you could create your own formatter or widget that perhaps did do something with these. For example, if maybe you wanted to create a validator to say, hey, if they select LCSH, validate that this URL that they gave me is actually an LCSH URL. You could easily add a new widget that extends authority link widget and adds a new validation. Something you could do if you wanted to. You would just be giving it a different ID, extend the existing one, slap in your validation code. And actually, that's one thing that probably we'll mention later. If you make a change, clear your cache. Because that's usually, if a change doesn't show up, that's the first thing you got to think to do is clear your cache to make sure you're not preserving old representations of stuff when you're looking at things. Another module that we included is extended datetime format, and I didn't get, do I include, yep, okay. So EDTF stands for extended datetime format. This is a standard proposed by the Library of Congress for textual representations of complex dates, such as dates that have particular ranges, or dates that have uncertainty or approximations, or maybe you just want a year or a year and a month, but not year, month, and day, or maybe part of that's uncertain. It's a pretty complex standard for how to structure a date. Drupal did not support this concept at all. It did not exist. But I wanted these more complex dates, so I wrote a field to be able to represent them. It has its own shortcomings, which we can talk about in a moment too, if we would like. But again, if you go to we'll do that. We'll get around it. Okay, we're going to go to, again, this is going to be another field type, the datetime format. This one actually extends string. And you can see that's all it does. It's a string. I'm not adding any properties to it. I'm not changing anything about how it is stored. It is simply going to be a string, and I am defining that it has an ID, the default formatter, default widget as well, giving it a name. And also giving it a constraint as well, which we can get into, but it's a bit more advanced for what's going on there. But when it comes down to it, the only thing I'm extending with this plugin is the definitions that we have here. Again, that's how much Drupal leverages these annotations, is sometimes that's all you need is the annotations to do what you want. So most of the code here is actually in the formatter and in the widget and these other pieces here. Actually, I might as well mention it right now. The constraint is didn't actually write the constraint. This came later, which was a great addition. I don't remember who contributed this, but it was really good. One of the things that I had done previously is I had put all my validation in the widget, which was nice for adding items via the web interface, because it could tell you that this is no good. In fact, I have an example of that really quick. If you try to stick in this nonsensical date, it's going to yell at you saying, I couldn't parse that date, it's no good, try again, right? But this widget only works with the web interface. Constraints, on the other hand, will also enforce this when it comes to adding new content via the Migrate API or adding things via REST. So using Islandor Workbench, using any of the migration tooling. This is why constraints are nice for doing validation, is because we can catch the different ingest points using it. And I don't know as much about this because I didn't write the particular part, but I know I'm grateful for it. And that's also one of the nice things of turning this over to the community, because it wasn't just me working on this anymore, doing this. But again, we create the widget to say, hey, here's how you enter the data. And the only thing I added to the widget, other than it being a string, was the validation. Does this validate? So here's my, no, that's wrong tabbing. There we go. Over here, and we can scroll down. Go to field, widget, EDTF. In here, we have our validate, which says, first of all, if it's empty, well, it's empty, it's not a date. We also, because there's a huge chunk of code here and validation is a bit more complex and we might want to validate things elsewhere, I created utils, which in this case I used static. It might have been useful. This was before I really understood dependency injection, to be honest. This is a case where I could have refactored this to be a service, which was injected instead, but I didn't know it yet. So it's a static class. It is what it is. But it validates and says if there's any errors, report back there's errors, and it won't actually save the form. Oh, the other part on there. Oops. There we, we have the settings. So the widget also has some additional settings that you can control, whether or not you want to have strict dates. So this would be if you want to place even more constraints than the EDTF spec says. So if I want to be able to use like the range features, the intervals feature of dates, but I don't want them to say, hey, this date was in a particular month. I'm basically saying, is this a date that we can actually point to a particular day on a calendar or not? By default, no. That's one of the reasons why we have it, is because we want it to be more open. But if you did want to take this field and lock it down a little bit, you can. Whether or not intervals are supported and sets are supported. And I also define a form for controlling this on the interface as well. So whether or not it's strict dates, intervals, or sets, which you can see here. Actually, I was looking at the wrong form. This form is actually for the formatter. I mean, the widget has its own settings. The form has its own settings. It would help if I got to the right tab. Matters. F, which has, of course, the ability to say, how do we actually want to view the element? So this is the actual rendering of it. but we can also say, hey, this is the form for controlling how I want it to display. So what date separator are we going to use? What's the date order that we're going to use for this particular display mode of it? So if you didn't want to display it as dash separated, so the standard is very ISO 8601 standard. I may have gotten the ISO number on that wrong off the top of my head.
08601.
Okay, I think I said that, but yeah, it is 8601, where you have the 4-digit year hyphen 2-digit month hyphen 2-digit day, which is the default here, using a dash, year, month, day, year format. You could also change this to be, hey, I want spaces, and I want it to be, or slashes, and I want it to be USA style, so it's month, day, year, which is we refer to as middle endian dates. And or perhaps I wanted to have, like genealogists back in the day would have day 3 abbreviated month and then year, so that you would have little endian with spaces, and then the month would be the 3-letter month format. So there's a lot of control in how we want to structure your dates with this. It's not perfect, but it's okay. In this case, for example, I have how weird these dates can get. You have 2002, the 7th July, it's approximate and uncertain to 2022, 7/20. So by default, it would say, hey, year and month are uncertain, day is approximate to this particular date. But we could restructure this to be the other formatting of the days. So that's what that is. Because of how weird dates can get, some of these explanations can get rather nonsensical. There's been a lot of conversation about cleaning these up. In fact, if you go to GitHub and look at the issue queue and like the meta category of dates, you'll see a lot of conversation about dates and how we format them. So if you're interested in that, join the group. Things again, I shot myself in the foot. I was starting to make metaphors. I shot myself in the foot with this one as well, because I wanted to have these complex dates, and I didn't really understand how this would impact things like search. I said, hey, this is a string, easy to store because it's, the actual value here can be stored as a string, that's fine. And the dates didn't really work because they wanted epochs, which doesn't work with uncertainty. So I'm just going to use a string. What I didn't realize is that this would have impact for how search works, which means searching was only as a string by default, which again is not ideal. So we've been trying to do some workarounds. One of the things that we did was we created another plugin for the search API that says, hey, give me a processor that turns this into an integer range of the earliest possible year to the latest possible year. And we have some more catch-alls because EDTF has from like the beginning of time to the end of time support, which notably, computers don't do well with when it comes to integers of infinity. But so again, we have some catch-alls, some sensible defaults to catch things with that as well. It has its own form to control how you do that as well. So again, plugins everywhere for a lot of this. Any questions on those really quick before we move on?
So far, no on the chat. Gary, just
Right.
link to the local.
Oh, yes, thank you, Carrie. All right. JSON-LD link data. For those who aren't familiar with JSON-LD, this is a really brief primer, so you'll want to follow up on this. This module adds a simple Drupal entity to JSON-LD normalizer. So basically, take a Drupal entity and I'm going to turn it into this JSON structure that's specific to linked data, right? So it's just a serializer and normalizer. That's what it does the job. So what this allows us to do is say, hey, we've defined a bundle Islandora object, and it has a bunch of fields such as field full title and field alternate title and field EDTF date. And I want to give it some properties. So RDAU P60515, or, what probably makes more sense to people is DC terms alternative title. That's what this field is a Dublin core alternative field or a Dublin core title field. And so between this mapping which comes to us not from the RDF module, but it was defined using the standard of the RDF module, and my actual data, which has a member of large image, its own identifier, a JSON structure that supports linked data. Now, why this is important is because Fedora is a linked data store. And one of the ways that we can get linked data into it is through JSON LD structures. So we wanted to be able to index our Drupal content into Fedora, which meant we needed to get it to linked data. This is how we decided to do it. We built a module that says, hey, give me a Drupal entity based on this mapping that we're giving you. Give me linked data that I can then index in Fedora or the Drupal store. That, in a nutshell, is what this module does. You'll notice another thing that we have here for the EDTF date is, a data type callback, because again, Drupal doesn't really know anything about my EDTF format, file type. And I created a converter that says, okay, give me this date as a date ISO 8601 value. And so I've said, okay, RDF module, instead of just taking whatever Drupal gives you for the value, I want you to run it through this converter to turn it into a value that is better used by the linked data. So again, lots of ways that you can manipulate things with different plugins and different code and whatnot. So the pieces of this, you'll see the usual suspects in here. We have some routing, we have some services defined to get things together. Although in this case, not so many plugins. This is not a place where Drupal does a lot of plugins, is with the serializers. But we have a number of different pieces. I'm not going to run through all of these. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of work here to say, hey, based off of the routing, where you want a JSON LD, we're going to generate the JSON LD for you and encode it for you, and do a lot of normalization of your content entity and your field item and your field and your file field and your entity reference as well. So there's a few pieces in here that you, if you're interested in how serialization works, this is a good place to go poking around. However, the main reason I bring it up is because there's also something that we actually didn't talk about with Drupal is hooks. In part because hooks was really big in early versions of 7 of Drupal, and they've started to move away from it into these plugins. But there's some places where hooks still play a very important role. And one of the things that we have in JSON LD is a hook defined where I can alter how this module works. So for example, in the hook JSON LD alter normalized array, in my controlled access terms module, I say I'm going to alter this JSON LD alter normalized array to do various important things. Again, Drupal doesn't know anything about linked agent. It doesn't know anything about EDTF. So I'm going to do some alterations in it by calling this hook. So in this case, if you find a field definition that's typed relation, again, it's looking, so, pot killing the kettle black here. I said, modules broke because they used the field definition instead of the interface. Well, I did the same thing right here. So granted, that said, I don't have an interface for typed relation. And this is particular to only typed relations. Of course, if someone subtypes it again, we'll have to fix it. But basically what we're saying here is, remember how I said that if you wanted with Drupal to create 32 different types of relationship, you'd have to have 32 different fields? Well, the RDF module made the same assumption. You're only going to have one property per field that you use. So what this does, it says, if you see typed relationship, grab that rel type and slap it in the place of the predicate rather than the one the RDF module used. So if you haven't been familiar with the Islandor ecosystem yet, or even the Drupal ecosystem at all, you can see how layered we get and how all these different pieces start to intermingle a little bit. So sometimes it's hard to find a starting point of where you're trying to go. You have to, start somewhere and then figure out where all the dots are connecting to before you catch all these things. And this code is cut because for brevity, it also continues on to do some EDTF work as well. That's our detour through defaults and controlled access terms in JSON-LD. We're going to go back to Islandora core for a few minutes. And I lied, because we're going to talk about the context module, which is used heavily by Islandora, but this module itself, context, is a separate module. It is one that we require because we do use it so heavily. But what this does is allows you to manage contextual conditions and reactions for different portions of your site. So basically, for example, you can define saying, if the node you're looking at has a particular term, such as OpenSeaDragon, I want you to display the OpenSeaDragon view mode. So it's a way to give repository managers, the people who are only looking at the front end, some small bit of if-then control over their site based off of conditions that you allow them to control and the reactions that you allow them to control. Like I said, Islandora uses context heavily. So these are all the different context conditions that we've defined in Islandora core. There's a lot here. There's a lot of different conditions that you can use to control different aspects of your site and how they work. For example, whether or not a media has a particular MIME type. Is this a JPEG? Is this a TIFF? Or is this a PDF? Whether or not a node has an ancestor or a parent that we just talked about. Whether or not a node is an Islandora object. Now this one is peculiar. There's been a lot of discussion in the community over the years about what is an Islandora object. And this actually codifies it to the presence of the media of the member of field. I think it's like the one qualifier right now. Is does it have this particular field on it? Whether it's published, et cetera, et cetera. Now, based off the condition that we define, you can select a number of different reactions to it. So we want you to delete it, or we want you to index it, or we want you, the one that a lot of people see most often is the view mode alter. Brief background for this. When in Drupal, if you have a node or a media that you want to look at, and you want to change which fields are displayed or in what order they're displayed in to the end user, you can define different view or display modes. So we can define one that displays these fields, another one that displays those fields. Well, those are referred to as the display mode, and we can control which one you look at, a person uses. So do I have this actually in here? No, I'll just bring it up really quick. Where's our Islandora site? So structure, going down to our content types, repository items, manage, display. We have a different display mode. So we have one display that uses PDF.js, another one for OpenSea Dragon, another one binary, another one teaser. And we can control which of these views of the object the person uses using this condition. So if you actually go to structure to your context, we actually group those down here together as display. We can go in here and say, hey, if the node has the term OpenSea Dragon, use the view mode OpenSea Dragon. And I have a code that goes into an example that goes into more detail about this a little bit later in the slides. That said, these conditions aren't always triggered by themselves. There's a number of cases where we've said, hey, at this particular point, we want you to go and see what conditions apply so we can apply the reactions. This happens with the node media file and taxonomy, insert, update, and delete hooks. So keep in mind that we don't have hooks for other types of entities. Like we don't have a config insert hook. I don't know if that even exists. But I mean, you could hook onto entity update, which would technically fire at that point. So we explicitly say, hey, go in here and see which conditions are being met to apply the reactions that need to be done. So these ones in particular trigger specific types of reactions for indexing and delete, right? Other hooks check for things like the JSON LD. As I mentioned, we have the controlled access terms hook that says, hey, go in and make all these changes, which we've essentially hard-coded there. The ifs and thens are all hard-coded in that module hook. What this does with the Islandor JSON LD says, hey, I'm going to go alter this, but I want you to use the context module to see if we've defined anything that should rewrite this JSON LD instead, right? So again, another building a layer out. We could hard code it, but in this case, we're giving the end users a chance to, the repository managers, I should say, an option to control how that's working on the UI side by using this context hook. So you do that with the JSON LD, but also with the view mode, which I just mentioned. There's also one for a form display alter as well. Side note, what about block placement UI? So the block placement also uses conditions. So the conditions, definitions, class definitions, that's the word I'm looking for, are not specific to the context module. Conditions are actually something that applies to Drupal core, which context then uses, which we then use by extension. And block placement is one of those places where Drupal uses those conditions on that UI that allows you to control what blocks go where, but only block placement, right? Unfortunately, some of our conditions have broken the block placement UI, and so we've also disabled them using another hook. So if you go into Islandora, form block, form alter, you'll see that we've said, hey, if you see this condition, just remove it from the form because we don't want to mess with your block placement. And it wouldn't apply anyway, because JSON LD alter has no implication in block placement, right? It doesn't help. Questions so far? Let's talk about events really quick. You'll see, in some cases, you see terms overloaded in Drupal, where depending on the context of the use of the term, it means different things. Context is one of those, because yes, there's the context module, but there's also other places in Drupal where they use the context term to refer to other things. So be careful. So we're also guilty of this in terms of events, which we talked about. We did talk about events earlier this morning, where you can subscribe to events. We do that a little bit. For example, the admin views route subscriber extends another route subscriber base to alter some of our routes to be admin and require custom access permissions. However, we also have the event and event generator directories, which aren't really associated with Drupal events. They'll use a Drupal event later, but in and of themselves, keep in mind that when you see these two directories in the Islandora code base, we're not talking about Drupal events. We're talking about events that we are generating. So I mentioned that here. It's not really those. These are actually built for extending the stack to use microservices. Stop messages to send to ActiveMQ. So for example, this is the example I had that I was going to get into a little bit. So for example, Drupal executes an insert and update media hook. So we're updating a media. So for example, you have a node, you click on the add media button and you upload an original file, say a TIFF. That's going to execute this insert hook for media. Our code there calls utils. Of course, it's been brought in there through a service call, so we're using the service. Execute derivative reactions to execute media reactions. Utils then uses context manager to see which contexts are active. So did we use the MIME type condition? Did we use a media has term condition, which I think is the one we actually use by default? Do any of these conditions exist that are met, that we now need to go do the reactions? So for example, for derivatives, the derivative reaction class extends another preset reaction, which calls the derivative actions they're configured with. I initially was going to show you this whole thing in a lot more detail, but I decided that would have taken the entire 3 hours. So I am glossing over some things here, and I am happy to talk about them later if you want to. But then these actions, for example, generate the image derivative, which is in the Islandora image submodule of Islandora. Again, a lot of these things are intersecting with each other. Extends yet another abstract generate derivative, which extends this, which extends that, which finally extends emit event. So basically we have a bunch of wrappers which get to finer and finer granularity of what we're trying to do. So all of our derivatives end up in this emit event class that says, hey, we're going to build a message. In fact, this is what this says. Emit event then creates and sends a stop message by first getting the relevant configurations that came from the forms that this class included. Like I said, plugins, forms, that's a big thing that we do here for configuration. It's going to grab the related configurations and it's going to issue a stomp event, triggering the stomp event subscriber, which returns a JWT. I'll talk about JWTs very briefly in a little bit, but basically it says this is who you are and what roles you have for the person executing the action. This is basically for authentication purposes. And then creates the message that's then going to be sent to ActiveMQ. So even just to say, hey, I'm going to upload a media and I want derivatives to happen, there's a whole chain of code that's actually fairly easy to get lost in if you don't have a guide like this or some familiarity with how these things build on each other. Okay, so the stack gets a bit complex there. So again, side note, JSON web tokens used to authenticate messages. we use yet another Drupal module because we're trying to use the community stuff. This message details who's issuing the message, what the rules are, and when the token expires. Basically, trying to summarize really quickly, when you have issues with derivatives, more often than not, if it's with JWT, it's either because the person who executed the action didn't have the Fedora admin role on their user, or the JWT module was misconfigured, or it took too long between when the message was issued and when it was being processed. We can talk more about this when it comes to debugging, because a lot of times when derivative problems happen, this is, in my experience, one of the issues that will come up with this. So what happens to the messages we emit? So of course Drupal, via that emit event class that we just detailed, that whole stack, sends this event to ActiveMQ. This could be really any message queuing service like RabbitMQ. Amazon has their own event messaging tool. I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head. What was that? Amazon M2, yeah. Which then Alpaca, which we'll talk about in a moment, then looks for these messages in the queue to start, and then we'll call the microservice that actually generates the item, which pipes it back through Alpaca and sends it to Drupal. So this is now, we're starting to get out of the Drupal stack into the rest of the microservices stack. Alpaca is middleware. Its sole purpose is to know how to find messages in the queue, tell the related microservice what to do, and return the results. That's all it does. When you get into the code itself, most of these components are really simple. In past days, this was a really annoying piece of the stack, in part, in my personal opinion, because it was using Carafe, which was a bit finicky, in my opinion, for managing. But now you can run.
Yeah, it's awful.
Yeah, okay, just getting concurrence there. Carafe is terrible. Now you can run it as a self-contained jar, which really simplifies the system admin, in my personal opinion. But when it boils down to it, the important thing about Alpaca is that it provides 3 connectors. One that says, hey, I have a request for a derivative. I'm going to send it to the appropriate derivative service. It doesn't care if it's Houdini or Homerus or the text extractor derivative service. That's when you can use that same one over and over again for derivatives. We also have one for indexing in Fedora and another one for indexing in the Drupal store. Fortunately, in a lot of things that you're probably going to do, you're probably going to be extending the derivative one. Not extending it, you're going to be using this one. You probably won't have to touch the Alpaca code at all. It is rare instances where we've had to touch Alpaca. I think the most recent instance where we really had to touch it was when Eli Zoller was including revision support to the FC repo 1. I think that's been the one major update to that, other than making it self-contained, which was beautiful. Thank you, Jared Wicklow, for that. But yeah, over the past 4 or 5 years, this has stayed relatively lean. Crayfish is a collection of Islandor microservices, and this isn't even all of them. The microservices that are available to community. There's a FITS file identification one that is not technically part of Crayfish, but is along the same vein. But we have a number of services: Homerus for FFmpeg, Houdini for ImageMagick. These are all, they're in one repo because they're all doing fairly similar things. We're doing some of the same things together, and they're all Symfony Flex web apps, essentially. So if you're interested in extending this, you're getting outside of the Drupal space. you're now in Symfony Flex space when you're playing with this, which admittedly, I have not had to touch at all because I haven't had to write one of these. So that's my lack of knowledge on to how really well to do this effectively. But this is one place where you would want to go to look as well for how to do that. So another thing that's okay. Any questions about? We can talk more about how this whole process works. But again, going back to this point, what happens with the whole microservices stack? A lot of it is just getting to the point to where you're emitting the message. And then getting it to one of the connectors. If it's the derivatives, you're going to be extending those derivative classes that we already have for you. And then writing your microservice that responds to it. Although Alan could talk more to this than I could with the FITS experience.
Yeah, we've got a whole hour and a half session.
Yeah. Yeah. That is coming. That is in our tips and tricks for debugging and developer experience. We will get there in just a minute. Yeah. Yeah, that's in Alpaca, and that's more of the Alpaca is extending a lot of service. So if you actually look in Alpaca, I actually did link this one. A lot of that is in the code that Alpaca is extending, because Alpaca itself is built on Apache Camel. And again, I don't know a lot of the details in here because I haven't had to touch a lot of it, but the connector derivative really boils down to two classes, one that's just defining options, and this one, this is essentially all it's doing right now. It says, hey, here's the route that we're looking for this particular derivative. Grab the JSON object, so we have the data that we need for the microservice to know what it's doing. Send some headers around, and then put the media back in Drupal. Everything else with saying how many consumers that it has is really built into the stack that this is built on top of, which is Apache Camel. Yeah, yeah, and that's also, I think, described here in the README, where there's a configuration file for each one, where you can have, how many concurrent consumers that you want, yeah, and how many max consumers, so you don't overwhelm yourself as well. Yeah. Yeah, but by virtue of being middleware, it is intentionally lean, because it is simply just trying to connect one service to the other service and not be opinionated about what's going on between the two, which is why it can be so lean. Yeah, well, yeah, we can dig on graph later. The other thing I wanted to mention is the pen and image zoom image viewers, because this really touches on some of the same concepts, but it's not the same type. It's a different use of the context than the derivatives. So for example, for the viewers that we have supporting IFFF, OpenSeaDragon is the one that's included by core. Mirador was written afterward and attached to Islandor defaults, although it should probably be broken out into its own module later. Yeah. And also a IIIF image server Cantaloupe is another service that we use, which you could kind of call it a microservice, but it's another service that we leverage for using these pen and zoom viewers. So another example of how this all plays together is a user visits an item, and Drupal again checks, using those hooks, checks context conditions to see if they apply. So by default, if an item has the OpenSeaDragon tag, Then the OpenSeaDragon context, we reuse OpenSeaDragon so many times in here. I'm sorry, it's hard to keep track of which OpenSeaDragon we're referring to. But that context will fire off the view mode reaction. And that reaction is configured to use the OpenSeaDragon view mode, which I showed you briefly. That view mode then includes a entity view attachment. So basically what this is this takes a Drupal view and treats it as a field in your display, is what this is used for. So this will say, hey, go and find me media and return this in a view and display as if it's a field. This EVA brings in the original file's OpenSeaDragon media view mode. So this view has a configuration for the view mode of the media it should display. So media also has an OpenSeaDragon view. Again, we reuse OpenSeaDragon quite a bit. Formatter. All this formatter does is takes the file URI and constructs a IIIF URI so that the OpenSeaDragon viewer, which runs in JavaScript on the user's browser, knows to go to talk to the server to get the image in question. So again, there's a lot of moving parts here where you need to start stepping through to figure out where are the pieces, what exactly is the part of the stack that you want to extend is always the question with your starting point to move forward. Questions on this really quick? And I can step through this one a little bit easier if anyone's interested in a walkthrough of how these pieces jump together. Right. So we've done a whole lot of talking about fundamental concepts of Drupal, its APIs, how things are hooked together. We spent quite a bit of time talking about how Islandora takes those APIs and those concepts and then uses them to shift assumptions and to do some more other specialized things, such as trying to get derivatives, trying to get different JavaScript viewers, such as OpenSeaDragon, to work. We recognize that this is all, it's not always intuitive where the flow goes. In part, we did this because we wanted to make this system as extensible and as customizable as possible. But that means, you're taking all these different parts and plumbing them together and allowing you to do your own plumbing as well with all these different pieces. There's a lot of connectors, and it can sometimes be hard to follow from one to the other. So what we're going to be talking about now is how do you actually trace these things through the system so you can figure out what's going on when you're using the system. So if something breaks, you'll have an idea as to where the breaking is happening, or if you want to extend it, where you might need to jump off from to move on. And Nigel, I will let you take over from there. Any questions before we jump into that, though? Before we leave the theoretical, these are all the pieces and components and what they do. I couldn't hear, there was a bit of noise there.
Oh, sorry, it's the, I haven't used it.
Yeah.
How do you get in and check your file? So if you want to go in and.
Yeah, what exists. Graph is no longer part of the picture.
So.
One configuration file that defines the connectors. Yeah, and we can one-on-one that too, if you want to look at that too. I will say with all the graphs and microservices, was it University of Toronto, if I remember correctly, Nat? They've done a lot of work with replacing the ActiveMQ with more purely Drupal solutions, and I should get closer to this microphone, that uses yet another Drupal API of the Q API. and there's a module called Queue Advanced Runner that puts maintenance of those queues and these messages within Drupal itself as an alternative. A lot of this plumbing still applies in terms of context and whatnot, the context reactions. Where that chain breaks with their solution is that it's actually maybe still be doing the stop messages. I don't remember, I would have to look. But again, understanding the stack is knowing where to break it to do something else. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, again, we made it really complex so you can do a lot of stuff with it and you extend it the way you want. Neither good or bad for you to do that. In fact, it's probably good for you to do that. But you do need to get an understanding of where it falls in the stack so you know where to insert yourself and diverge. Okay. You were gonna help us debug stuff.
Yeah, another old meme. So yeah, there's two CLI tools that are popular for managing Drupal. One's called Drush, one's called Drupal Console. You can use them both. Just install Drupal Console first. Otherwise, you'll just have a bad time. Dependencies, Drush has more frequent updates, so they're going to pull in newer stuff, and so they'll conflict. So it's always better to just install Console first. Very useful tool. You can use it for generating code, for a module, for rebuilding your routes. We talked about routers earlier, for importing and exporting configuration, for doing some debug tasks. Very useful. Still probably not as popular as Drush. Does a lot of the same stuff. Some of them, there's some stuff that Drupal Console does that Drush doesn't do. So just use them both, and if you want to do something, check your favorite. If it doesn't have it, check the other. I've put some commands which I type every single day in the table there. So that's cache rebuild, which was mentioned before. It's like if something's going weird, just rebuild the cache. That's your go-to one. Config import and export, that's for the YAML configuration entities and other config that we talked about earlier. So writing them out onto disk and reading them back in. SQL CLI will allow you to hop into MySQL or Postgres and be able to do queries and do that sort of fun stuff. PHP CLI will open a REPL with PHP, but it like loads all of Drupal's classes, so you can like access services and debug your code while you're writing it. Logging. So there's two different ways in which Drupal logs stuff to the database. The most important one is the watchdog. This is where most important events and errors will go. It's used by all the contribute modules and all of core. So there's a service, again, comes up, named Logger Factory, which will give you the ability to write to the logs or write to the watchdog. It's accessed through channels, so you have to tell it which log you're writing to. They're all in the same database table, but they just get named accordingly. Typically, it's going to be your module name. So like there's a system module, there's an Islandora module. So the Islandora channel in the Islandora module is used for Islandora logs. Access to that class in the ways we talked about before. So there's dependency injection and some links to some examples there. The logs have a severity, so debug, error, warning, the stuff you typically see in all bits of software. So those would just be functions on the logger. I suppose one thing to talk about here with the links. So whenever we instantiate a logger, we generally take the base and then pass in our channel. So then you don't have to do that later. You just get an instance with the channel and you can interact with it. Also just support an additional context argument called link, which will allow you to put like a link in the operations column of the you can access the watchdog under reports and recent log messages, and then you'll see the whole list of them. So over here, the column farthest to the right, operations, you don't see anything there, but oh, there's one, field settings. So field settings were changed. If you populate the link of the context, then you'll get this little link here with the title, and that'll take you to whatever was changed. So that's quite useful if you're writing something that, you know, is logging, oh, I've updated my entity. You can embed the link to the entity, and then someone going through the logs can see exactly which one was changed. Watchdog. We also have like this idea of other logs, they just broad category. So it's managed by a module. So they create an additional table. Usually this is if it's doing some sort of long running batch process where they want to link an action in the batch to some particular error message. Like that context would be lost if you're just using the watchdog log because it's for the whole entire site, not for like a single batch run of actions. And so one good example is the migration API. It has a separate logs table. So when you run a migration, you can say, oh, okay, this item in the migration failed and this is why, and have a link back to it. We won't go into the debugging too much or into the stuff there because I think we're technically over time, right? It was 2:30. So I'm going to just try to power through a lot of this. Application logging. So this is sort of a side note. ISLE is a special use case because it's using Docker. Our convention here is just to pipe everything out to standard output and standard error. So if you're running the container, I mean, if you're familiar with Linux terminology, that's, you know, you'll just get it as output from there. It's not writing to a file on disk. Using Docker allows you to hook up different logging systems. Because everything goes to standard out, you can hook it up to like AWS logs or systemd or like whatever. There's some documentation in the Docker website for that. And all of the services that are implemented in ISLE have environment variables, which can control the logging level. So your standard info, warning, debug, what have you. So you can do it on a per service level. Yeah, I'm going to like completely breeze through all of these slides. These are just going to tell you where you can find the log and links to the documentation for each log for all the different services. So we've got ActiveMQ, Alpaca, Tomcat, BlazeGraph. There's a lot of them. I don't know what they all do. S3 repo, Nginx and Apache. So in ISLE, it's using Nginx. I think Playbook uses Apache for the two different web servers. Solar. Then for the microservices, it's going to be each, oops, I should have put in more. I've only linked Hypercube. So each service has its own configuration done up with this Symfony something or other, I can't quite remember, where it says log, the log level, and where it's going to write the file. So each of the different ones, so Hypercube. Oh, is that out of date? The config examples? Oh, okay. My bad. It should be documented in the module though. There's the Devel module, which is 100% a must if you're doing any Drupal development. It adds a couple of functions which are really handy. I've got a link there to the documentation, but these are the three I use all the time. So print a variable message on the page. So if we're at like, it'll show up somewhere here, just like right on the top, whenever you're doing something. DD, which writes to Drupal debug.txt in your temporary directory, so that'll be like /temp. This is super useful if you're doing something and you want to debug and get a message out, but it doesn't have any web UI front end. Like say you're writing like a drush command or something. It's going to be run from the CLI. Or if you're doing something with like install profiles, because like not all the systems are ready and up at that point. So if you try to like write a message to a screen during that, it's just not going to work. And debug backtrace will give you like a full backtrace of the code up to that point. So they're quite useful. It's got a lot of different little menu options here at the top level. You can also see this on the site if you're playing along at home. Devel here, same links here. So you can go and look through all these like rebuild menus and so forth. Yeah, a couple of these are just a form that essentially submits. One is to clear the cache. Same as using drush, as a moment ago we've seen the command. Rebuilding the menu, so that's essentially rebuilding routes, running cron. And then we've got a number of different forms for editing configuration. So when we're talking about the configuration API, this is essentially the YAML that gets written out on the top bit. And then below with this form, you can edit it by hand if you want to. You can look at containers. So this is for the services that we were talking about before. You can see who instantiated a particular service if we were to go there. Oh, that's on Island. I linked to Sandbox for some reason instead of the actual local development environment, my bad. But if you were to go to the same URL, instead of Sandbox, islandora.ca. And I mean, you can log in there too, it'll work too. But if you go to your local instance, you'd be like drupal.traffic.me and then the same path. And so you can see every service that's in the system. And if you were to click on, say, something like Devel, you can then see some more details about it. I mean, this one's quite boring. If you want to look at, say, like Utils, so Islandor Utils, bring that up. You can see it's much larger. There's other stuff going on there. Maybe that's too large. It might have just crashed. Well, your mileage may vary. You can also inspect routes. This is the one I use the most often for all these different menus. So sometimes because you're defining stuff in YAML and you might make some mistake, you're like, why isn't my route showing up? You can go there and look and see if it is and if it's getting the appropriate arguments to it. And if you want to copy someone else, like what they're doing, you're like, why does this route redirect to the admin section? You go in there and see the setting for it. Xdebug and other profilers. Noise for Rick and Morty fans out there. So Xdebug setup. So there's like 2 incompatible versions of Xdebug that kind of float around at the moment. 2 is officially deprecated, so like don't use it, but a lot of us get stuck with older Cent boxes and get stuck with older Debian boxes, and 2 might be what's installed. So use 3 if you can, 2 if you can't. The configuration is very different between the 2. I've got links to the documentation for both, so read the one that's applicable. There's usually 2 separate configurations for this. One's for CLI and one's for your web interface. I've got the link there or the path for Nginx with FPM. If you use Apache, it's going to be a different path. If you use a different version of PHP, it's going to be a different path. Different operating system, different path. But generally, there's one that's for CLI use, and then there's one for Nginx or Apache. And it's going to vary depending on your system. So yeah, let's do a little quick demo. I've got some links in here. You guys got the slides, so you can click on the links, so you don't have to hang out here for too long. So there's plugins for the browser that allow you to like dynamically toggle on and off Xdebug, kind of. I'll get into it in a couple of moments. So let's take a look at your local environment, my local environment. In the browser, ide.traffic.me. We're just going to go to the very top, go to web, and index.php. So every request that comes into Drupal hits this file first. This is like the top level before the whole thing gets bootstrapped. And if we just throw in like a little breakpoint there, click on, there's a little bug and play symbol, and we're just going to start listening for Xdebug. Cool. So that's connected. It's listening on a particular port for it. I can move this. Let's actually go to the Drupal site. I guess it doesn't really matter which page, but we'll go to the home page. So nothing happened. It's refreshed, great. But I have that plugin installed for Chrome already. And if I go and click on debug to enable that, it's going to insert a cookie into my request that says, hey, Xdebug, do something. And so now you see when I went to refresh the page, it's kind of stopped doing anything. I get the little red light over on my IDE. So I've got a breakpoint, which is awesome. Here you can see the locals, see the environment, not environment variables, but the variables that are available to me in this local scope, see the globals, yada, yada. And you can add your own watches and stuff. So if I want to know what is auto loader, like that object and all of its properties. So this is a lot more convenient than print statements. You also have the access to the debug console. So you can start to type in stuff here, like what's 1 + 1, 2. Yeah, that checks out. And whenever step through, step over, step into functions, hop around, and stop eventually. We'll stop that. Often what will happen if you try to debug a page because of timeouts and things, it won't work. So if you go back, it's like, oh, it didn't work. But mostly this is about like getting information as to why stuff's broken rather than continuing a request all the way to completion. So there's a bit of a performance hack that I have going on with this setup, with this IDE. that I think people should know about. So turning on Xdebug, even if you're not using it, even if you don't insert that cookie, really does hurt your performance. It slows down a lot. So like, for example, when I'm installing a Drupal site from scratch, if Xdebug is turned on, even if I don't have that cookie in place, probably takes like 5 to 8 minutes for the site to install. If Xdebug is not turned on, it's about 1.5 minutes. So you can see that sort of level of performance drop off. So what I do in this particular setup is I run 2 instances of PHP FPM, and then I toggle between them. One has Xdebug turned on, one has Xdebug turned off. And then if there is a cookie in the request, Nginx chooses the one with Xdebug, and if not, it routes it to the normal one. So if I don't, if I go to this page and I turn off my debugger, it's going to a separate instance of PHP FPM. So it's nice and snappy. Some more links to the plugins. Oh yeah, so this is what's built into Isle. So if you use that same editor here with Isle, you'll get that stuff for free. With the debugger, it's all set up for you. You can customize the flags that you pass into Xdebug with the Xdebug flags environment variable. I've got links to the documentation for Isle for that. And additionally, if you're going to use Xdebug, you got to jack up those timeouts, because normally on a production site, you're going to like, oh, I want to get my response out within 30 seconds, at most 60 seconds. But when you're debugging something, you're not going to figure it out in a minute. So I tend to put it up to 5 or 10 minutes for all the timeouts, so that the request doesn't get killed on me while I'm actively debugging it. And those are the nice list of variables there. Help with that. So profiling, you can use Xdebug for more than just debugging. You can use it for profiling. There's in Xdebug 3.0, there's a mode property, which allows you to choose between debug, profile, and trace. And so this will give you different outputs and do different things. Profiling is essentially going to periodically sample the program as it runs to see how long it's been in each function, what the memory usage is in each function, and then it's going to record that. Once you have that recorded, you can view it in like cache grind, queue grind, or win cache grind. These are all sort of platform specific tools that all do exactly the same thing. And you can see here that it looks complicated, but basically it's ranking the functions by the amount of time spent in them. So this isn't like from Drupal. This is just some image I grabbed off the internet for a different like Symfony thing. No, CHMX. Oh, but it's something PHP. So you can see a call stack whenever you click on any particular function. So we can see at the top of the tree, main has called into require once, has called into page info, has called into act dispatch. And then you can kind of see the breakdown of where time has been spent on each of those things. Tracing is, another one of these modes that you can turn on. It's very useful if you want to look at things with a flame graph. And there's a tutorial there about how to set that up. This is not actually set up in same with profiling cache grind. This is like external tools you have to download and use. They're not like built in with the environment. But this is a flame graph, super little useful thing. Basically, it's interactive. It's an SVG where at the very bottom level, you have like your main function, so the process that called into it. And then as you go up these towers of flame, you see where time has been spent. So like the whole request extends from main down into these functions and down into these functions and down into these functions, yada, yada, yada. But you can kind of see where the bulk of time has been spent, where it's gone really deep on function calls versus where it's quite shallow, but still expensive. So in this case, file get contents, this is where I'd be like, okay, why are we spending so much time reading from disk, right? This is a significant chunk, very far down on the chain, that's taking up a large portion of the graph. I would be like, okay, is there something we can do about this? For example, I had issues before where we're using fly system and interacting with S3, and there was something slow about that, but it shows up as a file get contents because it's still, reading from some sort of external URL, so not from disk. And you're like, oh, okay, I'll dig into that bit and find out why there's some performance problem there. Well, I should actually show. When you click on any one of these things, you go down to that level. So you can kind of navigate down and up those little towers of flame to get more detail. Prof is another tool that's useful for memory profiling in PHP. I don't think there's any pictures here for this one. So yeah, it reports non-free memory at arbitrary points in the program. You can look at it in CalGrind or pprof and track all memory allocations by PHP itself as well as native malloc. So sometimes some code in PHP is actually calling into some C library. So like when you enable X debug, it's a library written in C that is loaded into PHP dynamically at runtime. And that's where the code's executed. It's executed in some like C code there. So you can't see into it. And some other stuff is like that, particularly low level things. So occasionally, very rarely, you may need to go like, why is this so slow? And you might want to actually profile the C code or something and go look into that. Probably not going to come up for anyone, but this is a useful way to do that. Other services, so ActiveMQ, it's got a REST API. It's got a way to control the number of consumers, which was just mentioned earlier. Here's the little bit in IL build kit that controls that and the two environment variables that go into it. So more consumers means faster processing. They're each pulling off of the queue in a round robin fashion, I believe, by default. So say if you have 8 of them, they can take 8, and until one is finished, like nothing else is going to get pulled off the queue. You can run as many as you've got memory and processing power for. By default, I think it's just set to 1. You can view ActiveMQ messages by the web interface. So let's see if we can zoom in. We can see all the connectors that were talked about earlier, like connector for Homeris, which is the derivative service, one for Fits, etc. There's the ones for indexing and then deleting from FC repo, and for the triple store. The downside of these queues is that as soon as a message is consumed, it's gone. So you can't really like debug things as they're happening because the message has already been consumed, unless they're being processed very slowly, which you can see them. So, excuse me. There's a CLI that comes with ActiveMQ. I've just put the path in which it's typically installed if you're installing outside of a package manager for ActiveMQ. Oops. You can view some stats and you can control and do some things like pausing queues. Additionally, there's also a REST API that is useful, provided by Julakia. Not 100% sure how to say that, but here's an example URL. So ActiveMQ, this is running at this point. It's got a path, API Joomla. Type is like the type of REST action you're going to do. Generally, it's going to be exec, like in this example. And then you're saying, I want to interact with the broker. The broker's name is localhost. The destination type for my request to execute is a queue. Destination name is the particular queue. So in this case, Islandor connector Houdini. And the action I wanted to do is pause. So if you were to copy this URL, but change, say, ActiveMQ to be the URL to where you have ActiveMQ set up, and you have this enabled, you can make a curl request to just pause a queue. So if you have like 20 messages in it and you want to debug, see what's going on, pause the queue, then you can go read through the messages and be like, oh, this is the stuff that's coming through. And when you're done, let it go. What I've used it for before with starting up and bringing up a box is sometimes I would bring in a lot of content using something like Content Sync, and I don't want to regenerate derivatives for everything. So I pause the queue, I run the Content Sync, brings all the content in, and then I just purge the queue and not do any of that. It's a sort of workaround to prevent reprocessing stuff. I've only discovered that fairly recently. Traffic is something that only really applies to IL, or if you're going to use Docker containers and roll your own. It's like a load balancer / router / DNS, not DNS, but like it does a couple of different things if it's a number of boxes. But anyways, it routes all the traffic between the outside world and all the containers internally. And if you want to know things about what's talking to what, like all these things that get put onto the queue, all things that get read from the queue, get passed to microservices, et cetera, they're all done over HTTP. So you can turn on access logs with traffic with these couple of arguments here, and there's some links to the documentation. And then if you go and just tail that log, you'll see a bunch of JSON objects come up for every single request with all the request headers, very useful for debugging. Questions? Oh, the question was, do I use the same tools for debugging to test if the code is secure? No. I don't know of any sort of like really good tools for testing if I wrote anything is secure. There's linters that come with, oh, this is actually quite good. Good point to bring up. So in with this editing environment, there's, depending on your keyboard, Control-Shift-V to bring up build tasks that allow us to have a custom commands and things for this environment. And some of them like code sniffer. So if I code sniff the current file, you see it just ran this little task there in the time in which it took and the memory it used. But it will do some checks for things like, oh, this is vulnerable to, what's the one with SQL injection or something like this. You're doing something bad. So if there's a sniff for that particular bad habit, it'll warn you. It's not like a catch-all, like security really requires a more focused mind, I say. Nobody gets it right. Nothing's automated to the point where it's just like taking care of it for you, which is unfortunate. But yeah. Good answers. The commands here, I should mention, that come up, well, command palette. You don't have to use any of these things or this environment for editing. It's just convenient. All these tools are available in other places. You just have to go like do a Google search for PHP-CS or PHP-CBF or PHP-CPD to be able to use some of these tools. But the tools that are defined here, there's a little folder here called VS Code with tasks in it, and that's where they're all written. So if you're curious as to like, okay, what's cache rebuild does, it just calls drush with cache rebuild and passes in the current site. You know, or if you want to see a better example, running code sniffer on the current file, it says this is the application, these are the configurations, and that's the file to run it against. And you can add your own if you want to as well for things that you run often. More questions? Yeah. Wait. Close it. No, there it is. Yeah, that's it right there.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing it there, and it's,
I think I'm on 05.
tried to use it with, when you install profile, it would overwrite the install.
Oh,
That's fixed or not, I'm wrong with that.
this is kind of like an interesting container in that like it has Drupal in it, but not. So what happens is this container mounts a volume that the Drupal container exposes. So Drupal's core folder or Drupal's install location. And so that's what allows us to be able to kind of walk through the code and do this stuff. It has nice auto completion, whatchamacalls it, go to definitions and whatever. But yeah, so the code, like it's not living inside of this container, so to say. The other thing to make this work is that all traffic gets routed to it instead of to Drupal. So that's how we get the debugger to be put in front of it. So when you go like Drupal.traffic.me, that's actually being routed to the same container that this is running in, not the Drupal one. But I mean, it has all the same code, has all the same dependencies, so it should like be the same. But yeah, I think it works. If your environment doesn't, we can hash it out and maybe create a ticket or something. Oh, I don't know. I don't use ILDC too much. I usually just like roll out a Docker Compose file. So if the ticket was there, I might have missed it. But if it gets onto the I'll build kit repo, I generally try to keep that to like less than 10 issues. Otherwise, I'll, Any other questions?
I think it's a reuse fund.
All right, cool. Cheers. Thank you, everyone.